Imagine you are a scholar.
Okay.
You're living in, let's say, 8th century Baghdad.
Right. So right in the thick of it.
Exactly. Your empire has just rapidly expanded. You're conquering these ancient territories left and right.
Just massive, massive geographical growth.
Yeah, and you are sitting there in this bustling marketplace. You're surrounded by all this dizzying wealth of a brand new global capital.
It sounds pretty great so far, honestly.
Right. But there is this massive, glaring problem.
Okay, what is it?
The mathematical, the medical, and especially the philosophical texts of the Greeks and the Persians that you've just, absorbed.
Right, all this newly acquired knowledge.
Yeah, they seem to completely contradict the literal interpretation of your newly established sacred texts.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that is a problem.
It's a huge problem. You have this profound divine revelation on one hand, and then you have the razor-sharp logic of ancient philosophy on the other.
And they're just on a total collision course.
Completely. So what do you do? I mean, do you ban the science? Do you try to rewrite your theology? Or do you, try to somehow merge the two and risk just tearing your entire civilization apart?
I mean, that tension, that specific dilemma is arguably one of the most explosive and consequential things in human history.
It really is.
The choices those specific scholars made back then, they didn't just shape their own era. They essentially laid the intellectual groundwork for centuries of global thought.
Yeah, influencing literally everything.
Right, both the East and the West, in ways that we're still unraveling today.
And that is exactly what we're exploring in this deep dive for you today.
It's a big one.
It is. We are taking a magnifying glass to the foundations of Islamic philosophy. And we're using some really incredible source material for this.
Yeah, we're looking at excerpts from Majid Fakhry's seminal work, A History of Islamic Philosophy. It's going to act as our roadmap today.
And just to be clear about our mission here, for you listening, we aren't just here to memorize a timeline of, hard-to-pronounce names and dates.
Definitely not. That would be incredibly dry.
Exactly. We want to extract the underlying mechanics here. We want to see how an entire civilization moved from reciting oral poetry in the desert to, debating the absolute most profound metaphysical questions of the ancient world.
We are looking for those critical turning points, the moments where religion, diverse cultures, and that relentless Greek spirit of inquiry violently collided.
Collided is such a good word for it.
It captures the reality beautifully, I think, because there is a really common misconception that we probably need to clear up immediately.
Oh, about who was actually doing the philosophy.
Right. There's this idea that Islamic philosophy was some kind of monolithic, single ethnicity endeavor that just happened in a vacuum.
Which is totally false.
Completely false. The sources we are analyzing today, they paint a picture of a massively cosmopolitan, totally cross-cultural project.
Right. It wasn't just one group of people.
No, you had Syrians, you had Arabs, Persians, Turks, and Berbers. All of them were throwing their intellectual weight into this movement.
I do want to point out, though, the text does note that the Arab element was preponderant.
True, yes.
Which is why, we often see it referred to as Arabic philosophy, right? But it seems like that's actually more about the language than, the actual DNA of the people doing the thinking.
Oh, absolutely. The language is the key to this whole thing.
How so?
Well, from the 8th to the 17th centuries, it didn't matter if a thinker was writing way over in Khorasan in the Far East, or if they were in Andalusia in modern-day Spain.
Right. Totally different ends of the empire.
Exactly. But Arabic was the unifying medium for all of them. It acted as this sort of universal operating system for the whole intellectual explosion.
That makes a lot of sense.
And furthermore, it was the specific Arabic interest in ancient learning, which was fostered by their leaders and their wealthy patrons, that provided the cohesive force for this entire cosmopolitan endeavor.
So they were paying for it.
They were funding it. They were encouraging it. Without that enlightened curiosity from the top down, the massive intellectual progress of this era simply wouldn't have been maintained.
Wow. Okay, so to really understand how wild this philosophical leap was, we kind of have to look at where they started, right?
We need to establish the baseline.
The cultural baseline, exactly. So looking at the notes we have here, the pre-Islamic Arab culture was incredibly localized.
Very much so.
It was primarily defined by oral poetry, literary tradition.
Right, because they didn't really have extensive written records in the same way other empires did.
That oral tradition was how they kept records of everything. Their social structures, their political alliances, their religious beliefs, and their moral codes.
And you have to remember, The environment totally dictated that culture.
You mean the desert?
Yeah, we were talking about a predominantly tribal society living in a really harsh, unforgiving geography.
Right.
So their intellectual output was necessarily a bit primitive, or at least regional and fragmentary.
Because you just don't have the time.
Exactly. Their daily existence was heavily focused on immediate survival,
Yeah.
on tribal loyalty.
Right, you don't have the luxury of abstract metaphysical speculation when your primary concern is, like, water rights.
Or clan warfare.
Yeah,
I
exactly.
mean, the oral poetry they produced was beautiful, and it was highly developed linguistically,
It's super complex.
very complex. But conceptually,
Yeah.
it was pretty much bound by the horizon of the desert campfire.
Okay, so they're at this campfire level of conceptualization, and then a massive cultural Big Bang happens.
The advent of Islam.
Right. Specifically, the revelation of the Quran to Muhammad between 610 and 632.
A total paradigm shift.
Reading Fakhry's account here, it seems like this didn't just give them a new religion. It completely and violently thrust the Arabs onto the cultural stage of the ancient world.
It was an abrupt entrance.
It handed them this coherent, bold, and just incredibly comprehensive worldview. And it shattered those narrow tribal confines almost instantly.
And the shift in perspective there, it just cannot be overstated. Islam introduced a universalist claim.
Meaning what, exactly?
Meaning that suddenly, these nomadic tribesmen weren't just thinking about their local rivalries anymore. They were invited to consider the creator of the entire cosmos.
Oh, wow.
They had to think about the nature of divine justice and the ultimate destiny of all mankind.
That is a massive mental upgrade.
It really was. It was an open invitation to engage with what the text calls the dazzling scientific and cultural treasures of antiquity.
Right, because they were expanding so fast.
Exactly.
Mm.
As the early Muslims rapidly expanded their territories, they suddenly found themselves governing lands that were steeped in centuries of Greco-Roman, Persian, and Indian thought.
So they literally went from memorizing local lineage poetry to suddenly managing the largest libraries and most complex bureaucratic systems on Earth.
Practically overnight, in historical terms.
But here's what I find really fascinating. Fakhry points out that while the Arabs assimilated the customs and the manners of the peoples they conquered,
Which is naturally.
right, but Islam was the one truly universal element they brought to the table.
Yes. It served as the new center of gravity for everything.
Okay, I like that. The center of gravity.
Right, because everything the Muslims absorbed from these older, more established civilizations, it all had to be reevaluated. It had to be reoriented around the core tenets of the Islamic faith.
It forced a completely new synthesis of knowledge.
Exactly.
You know, I try to put myself in the shoes of someone living through that transition.
It's hard to even imagine.
It really is. Imagine waking up one day and, like, discovering definitive proof of a multiverse.
Right.
Or, you know, realizing we actually are living in a computer simulation.
Your entire reality shatters.
Exactly. The fundamental parameters of your reality have expanded so violently that your old vocabulary just completely fails you.
You wouldn't have the words to describe what you were seeing.
Yeah, you would be desperately scrambling to build an entirely new system of knowledge just to process your normal daily life.
You would absolutely need new tools for thinking. And for that first generation of Muslims, the most immediate, overwhelming reality they had to process was the Quran itself.
Because it wasn't just a book to them.
No, Muslim doctrine doesn't view the Quran as merely a book of good advice or some kind of historical allegory.
Right.
It is believed to be the literal, uncreated word of God.
Revealed from, what is it, the preserved tablet.
Exactly, an eternal codex.
The physical weight of that concept is just staggering to me.
It's immense.
I was reading that this early generation of scholars was essentially paralyzed by their reverence for it. The text actually says they were overwhelmed by the awesome sacredness of the divine word.
Yes. The Arabic term is Kalām, the word.
Kalām.
And when you deeply believe you are holding the eternal, unalterable blueprint by which every single believer must order their entire existence.
Maybe mess around with it.
Exactly. Your first instinct is definitely not to philosophize about it.
Right, you're not going to debate it.
No. Your first instinct is absolute, rigorous preservation.
Which makes total sense.
Therefore, the very first true Islamic sciences that emerged, they weren't speculative at all. They were what we call the traditional sciences.
Okay, and those are things like reading and exegesis, which the source calls tafsir, right?
Yes, tafsir.
And jurisprudence, or fiqh.
Exactly.
So they were basically trying to build a perfectly accurate manual for living based entirely on these divinely revealed ordinances.
That was the goal.
And Fakhry mentions they also had to supplement the Quran with the traditions, right? The al-Sunnah.
Right, the Sunnah. That comprises the actions and the utterances of the Prophet Muhammad.
Because the Quran couldn't cover every little thing.
Precisely. The Quran outlines broad principles, and it has specific laws, but it obviously cannot explicitly cover every single microscopic detail of daily life in a rapidly expanding empire.
Like tax codes in Persia or something.
Right. So the early Muslims looked to the Prophet's own life as the ultimate practical commentary on the divine word.
Like a living example.
Exactly. How did he pray? How did he resolve disputes? How did he conduct commerce?
But developing these traditional sciences, it must have required subsidiary disciplines, right? I mean, you can't just read a text and apply it if the language itself is constantly shifting as the empire grows.
No, you can't. And that necessity, the need to preserve the exact meaning of the text that gave birth to Arabic grammar and rhetoric as formal, rigorous disciplines.
So they had to invent grammar schools just to read the book.
Essentially, yes.
Huh.
During the first 2 centuries of Islam, these linguistic sciences were developed chiefly as a means of adequately interpreting or justifying the specific usages that were found in the Quran and the traditions.
There is a detail in the source that I just loved.
Which one?
They actually started studying that old pre-Islamic campfire poetry again.
Ah, yes.
But with rigorous intensity. Not for its philosophical value, obviously, but they used it as a dictionary.
Yes. It was a massive philological rescue mission.
They needed to find venerable basis in ancient usage for unfamiliar or obscure terms that popped up in the Quran.
Right, they were reverse engineering their own language. They had to ensure they didn't misunderstand a single syllable of the divine command.
That is dedication.
And this drive for canonization was monumental. The text of the Quran was officially fixed under the third caliph, Uthman.
That was between 644 and 656, right?
Exactly. So aside from some minor grammatical refinements later in the 10th century, that core text was set in stone incredibly early on.
But the Sunnah, the traditions about the Prophet's life, they didn't have that immediate luxury.
No, they did not.
The source notes that these traditions circulated purely orally for almost 2 centuries.
200 years of oral transmission.
That is wild.
Across an empire stretching from Spain all the way to Central Asia.
That just sounds like a recipe for immense textual instability, like a massive game of telephone.
Oh, it was. A vast amount of apocryphal, totally fabricated material was inevitably added to the original core.
People just making things up.
Sometimes maliciously, sure, but often it was done by really well-meaning individuals who were just trying to lend prophetic authority to their own local customs.
Oh, I see.
Or to support their own legal opinions.
Like, oh yeah, the Prophet totally used to do this thing that my village has always done.
Exactly that.
So how did they possibly sort the divine instruction from all that localized noise? I mean, 200 years later.
It was incredibly difficult. By the middle of the 9th century, scholars realized they were facing a full-blown crisis of authenticity.
I bet.
They had to develop incredibly elaborate, highly rigorous criteria for sifting through this massive body of material.
Like forensic historians.
Very much so. They scrutinized the chains of transmission, they analyzed the character, the memory, and the historical intersections of every single person who passed the story along.
So if Guy A says he heard it from Guy B, they check if they even lived in the same city.
Exactly. Did they ever actually meet? Was Guy B known to have a bad memory? It was exhausting work. And this effort resulted in the compilations of the sound or canonical traditions.
And the most famous one of those is by al-Bukhari, right, who died in 870.
Yes, al-Bukhari's compilation is the most revered.
Okay, I want to pause here for a second and I want to challenge the fundamental premise of this early scholarly endeavor.
Okay, let's hear it.
Because if I am understanding this correctly for you, our listeners, these guys are essentially linguists, historians, and lawyers, right?
Primarily.
They are analyzing sentence structures and vetting historical witnesses to establish a perfect, absolute legal code.
Right.
But here's my pushback. Isn't this entire project a massive theological contradiction?
How do you mean?
Well, if the text is fundamentally divine, eternal, and absolute, then introducing human interpretation or legal extrapolation or independent judgment, it seems incredibly dangerous.
I see where you're going.
Like the moment a human lawyer says, well, the text doesn't mention this specific tax scenario in Persia, but based on my independent judgment, I think God would want this. Haven't you just corrupted the flawless divine law with flawed human logic? Doesn't the strict literalist approach make much more sense if your goal is preserving a perfect religion?
Your pushback here hits on the exact nerve center of early Islamic intellectual history.
Oh, really?
This was the precise tension that tore the early scholarly community apart. It birthed the very first major factions.
So they were fighting over this exact thing.
Yes, you had scholars who felt exactly the way you just described. They deeply believed that relying on anything other than explicit textual criteria was a dangerous usurpation of divine authority.
But wait, you can't run a sprawling cosmopolitan empire on a fixed set of 7th century Arabian rules without some flexibility, can you?
Well, that's exactly what the administrators realized. The judges dealing with the daily realities of the empire quickly realized the text couldn't explicitly cover every single concrete case they encountered.
Right, because life in Damascus or Jerusalem is totally different than life in Mecca.
Exactly. They needed a mechanism to extrapolate. And this necessity gave rise to a profound bipolarity in early Islamic law.
Fakhry breaks this down into two distinct camps in the text.
Yes.
So on one side, you have the liberal schools.
Right. And these were spearheaded by figures like Abu Hanifa, who died in 767, and al-Shafi'i, who died in 820.
And what was their argument?
They argued that it was necessary and legally valid, to use analogy.
Which is known as qiyas, right?
Yes, qiyas, and independent judgment, which is known as ray.
Okay.
They use these, especially in doubtful matters, where a specific, clear textual basis couldn't be found.
Can you give an example of how they'd use analogy?
Sure. So if the Quran forbade wine because it intoxicates, they used analogy to argue that any new intoxicating substance they encountered in foreign lands should also be forbidden.
Even if the text didn't specifically name that new drug or whatever.
Exactly. It wasn't explicitly named, but the principle remained.
I mean, that seems entirely rational to me.
It is very pragmatic.
But then you have the conservative schools, the people of tradition.
Yes.
Fakhry lists Malik b. Anas and Ahmad b. Hanbal as the heavyweights here. And from what I read, they absolutely despised this use of deductive methods.
They really did. They viewed human reason as hopelessly subjective and incredibly prone to error.
Right. They thought humans would just mess it up.
Exactly. And to give you a perfect, vivid illustration of this conservative, anti-interpretive mindset, the text provides a really famous anecdote about Malik.
Oh, I know the one.
It's about a specific reference in the Quran to God sitting upon the throne.
Right. Now, mechanically, if we just think about this, that is a massive philosophical problem.
Huge problem.
Because if God is physically sitting, it implies God has a body, right?
Yes.
It implies God occupies a specific space in the universe. It suggests God is bounded by physical dimensions, which completely contradicts the idea of an omnipresent, immaterial creator.
It limits him.
Exactly. If God is sitting on a throne, what is the throne made of? Who made it? It opens up this endless cascade of logical paradoxes.
The Greek philosophers would have absolutely had a field day deconstructing that image.
Oh, they would have torn it apart.
But when Malik was pressed on this exact contradiction by a questioner, his response totally epitomized the conservative stance.
He didn't try to explain it, did he?
No. He didn't offer an analogy. He didn't try to allegorize it at all. He stated firmly, the sitting is known, its modality is unknown. Belief in it is an obligation, and raising questions regarding it is a heresy.
Raising questions regarding it is a heresy. Wow. He just completely short-circuits the debate.
He shuts it down entirely.
He slams the door on speculative thought. You just accept the data point exactly as it is presented. You openly acknowledge you cannot understand the mechanics of how it works, and you move on.
It is a flat refusal to subject the divine word to human logic.
Right.
But the historical reality was that Malik's strict don't ask questions defense was fundamentally unsustainable.
Why? Because of the empire growing.
Yes, in the broader context of the ancient world, it just doesn't hold up. You can maintain that stance in a closed, homogeneous community.
Where everyone agrees with you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the Islamic empire was no longer closed.
They had expanded into places that were intellectual battlegrounds long before the Muslims even arrived.
Yes.
The text specifically highlights how Islam collided head-on with paganism, entrenched Christianity, and Judaism in these huge cosmopolitan centers.
And you have to understand, these were not simple, unlettered traditions.
Right. They'd been debating this stuff for centuries.
Exactly. Christianity and Judaism in the Near East had centuries of intense philosophical and theological refinement behind them.
They had the vocabulary for it.
They possessed highly developed logical frameworks for arguing about the nature of God, the soul, and the universe.
So if you are a Muslim scholar in that Baghdad marketplace we talked about,
Yeah.
and a highly educated Christian theologian or a Manichaean comes up to you with a complex, logically airtight argument against your faith.
Quoting Malik isn't going to save you.
No. Saying it's a heresy to ask just makes you look like you don't have an answer.
Exactly. You lose the argument immediately.
By the way, the text drops the term Manichaean here. For those of you listening who aren't medieval history buffs, what exactly were they arguing? What did they believe?
Well, Manichaeanism was a major religion founded by the prophet Mani in the Sasanian Empire.
Okay.
And at its core, it argued for a profound dualism.
Two gods.
Essentially, yes. They believed the universe was locked in an eternal struggle between two equal and opposing forces.
Like good and evil.
Exactly. A good spiritual world of light and an evil material world of darkness.
Which completely flies in the face of the Islamic concept of tawhid, right?
Yes, the absolute, uncompromising oneness and supreme sovereignty of a single God.
So a Manichaean would look at the suffering and evil in the world and argue logically. If your single God is entirely good and entirely powerful, why does evil exist?
Therefore, there must be two gods. That's their logical conclusion.
And a materialist would challenge the very concept of an unseen creator using early forms of empiricism.
Right. And if you just yell heresy at these people, as we said, you lose the debate.
And more importantly, you lose the intellectual high ground in a newly conquered society, which is dangerous politically.
Highly dangerous. You have to meet them on the battlefield of ideas. You have to fight logic with logic.
And according to our source, this external pressure, this need to debate, was the exact catalyst that birthed scholastic theology in Islam.
Yes, which is known as Kalām.
Kalām.
Historiographers from the period explicitly state that scholastic theology arose primarily as a defense mechanism.
So it wasn't just guys sitting around pondering the universe for fun.
Not at all. It was developed as a means of buttressing Islamic beliefs with rigorous logical arguments to fend off these outside attacks.
Wow.
Theology didn't begin as an ivory tower pursuit of higher truths. It began in the trenches of interreligious debate.
But the text also points out that the pressure wasn't just external, right?
No, it wasn't.
There were massive internal contradictions within the Quran itself that were starting to tear the community apart. Fakhry mentions the gloomy picture of God's overwhelming supremacy depicted in the text.
This is the classic, unavoidable paradox of any monotheistic religion.
The free will thing.
Exactly. But it was felt incredibly acutely in early Islam. Think about it. If God is completely supreme, all-knowing, all-powerful, and predestines every single action in the universe down to the falling of a leaf.
What happens to human responsibility?
Exactly.
If God wrote the script of my life before I was even born and forces me to act it out scene by scene, how can he justly throw me in hell for sinning?
It doesn't seem fair, does it?
No, I didn't have a choice. I was just following his eternal blueprint.
And that clash between God's absolute omnipotence and God's justice, that was the first major internal crisis.
I could see why.
It was generally recognized as the first major theological issue broached by early thinkers. Because, you cannot build a functioning legal system, which the Muslims were desperately trying to do, if the criminals can philosophically argue that God forced them to commit the crime.
Oh man, that is a great point. The devil didn't make me do it, God did.
Right. You can't prosecute that.
This is where a group called the Mu'tazila enters the picture.
Yes.
And the way Fakhry describes them, they are absolutely fascinating. They are like intellectual acrobats trying to walk this incredibly thin tightrope between preserving the faith and preserving human rationality.
The Mu'tazila were true pioneers in this respect. They stepped right into this raging debate to aggressively assert human freedom on the one hand and the absolute justice of God on the other.
But how did they mechanically argue that? If the Quran explicitly says God ordains all things, how do they carve out space for free will without just being labeled heretics and executed?
Well, they achieved it by elevating reason. While they always supported their positions with carefully selected quotes from the Quran, their general tendency was to advance arguments of a strictly ethical and rational character.
So they argued the logic of the situation.
Exactly. They argued that for the concept of divine justice to have any meaningful definition whatsoever, human beings must be the independent authors of their own actions.
Because if they aren't, justice is a meaningless word.
Right. God provides the capacity to act, but the human being freely chooses the action. Otherwise, the whole concept of reward and punishment is rendered logically absurd.
So they essentially argue that God's justice binds his absolute power.
Yes.
God cannot be unjust, therefore, he must allow free will.
That's the argument.
They are using pure rational logic to save the text from a literalist interpretation that would just render it completely contradictory.
And they applied this exact same rationalist toolkit to those thorny physical descriptions of God we discussed earlier.
Like God sitting on a throne.
Exactly. The Mu'tazila pioneered the systematic use of allegorical interpretation.
So they looked at Malik's don't ask questions approach and basically said, no, we actually have to look deeply at what this language is functioning to do.
Because they understood that language is limited.
Right.
They argued that to safeguard the absolute immateriality and the transcendence of God, you simply cannot take anthropomorphic passages literally.
Because it makes God seem like a guy in a chair.
Right, it degrades the divine. So when the text says God is sitting on a throne, it must be read as a powerful allegory for divine majesty, for absolute sovereignty and royalty.
Not a description of physical furniture in heaven.
Exactly.
Fakhry also notes they reinterpreted Quranic references to the possibility of believers physically seeing God on the last day.
Yes, because physical sight requires light bouncing off a physical object and hitting an eye.
And God is not a physical object.
Exactly. Therefore, the Mu'tazila argued this seeing must be interpreted as the possibility of contemplating God mystically or intellectually, not seeing him with physical eyeballs.
The larger implication here is profound for you listeners to understand. Theology in this era is a vital survival tool.
It really is.
Achieving internal harmony among all this conflicting textual data wasn't just like some fun academic exercise.
No, the stakes were incredibly high.
It was a matter of preserving the entire Islamic view of life from collapsing under its own logical weight, or being dismantled by rival religions in debates.
But here's where it gets tricky. As these theological debates became increasingly complex, as they started arguing about the precise mechanics of free will and the exact nature of divine attributes and the immateriality of the soul, the early Muslim scholars hit a wall.
What kind of wall?
They realized their traditional linguistic tools, the Arabic grammar, the rhetoric, the pre-Islamic poetry dictionary, they were vastly inadequate for this level of abstract speculation.
Ah, I see. You can't use a dictionary of desert poetry to debate a Syrian Christian bishop on the metaphysical substance of the Trinity.
No, it's impossible.
It's like trying to build a rocket ship using a manual for a horse-drawn carriage. The vocabulary simply doesn't exist yet.
They needed a drastically more sophisticated conceptual framework.
They needed an upgrade.
Exactly. They needed the ultimate ancient operating system for abstract thought.
And that operating system was Greek logic.
Specifically, the works of Aristotle and his commentators.
Okay, so this brings us to a massive turning point in our deep dive, the translation movement.
Yes, a crucial period.
Because how does a desert-born empire actually go about acquiring and integrating the most complex philosophical texts of the ancient world? Because they didn't just stumble upon these books buried in the sand.
No, it was a very distinct, staged process.
How does it start?
Well, the initial phase occurred during the Umayyad period, which ran from 661 to 750. But during this era, there was very, very little abstract speculative translation happening.
Why not? The Greeks were right there in their newly conquered territories, weren't they?
Yes, but the Umayyad caliphs were primarily concerned with the immense practical challenges of consolidating political power.
Right, running the actual government.
Right, managing a vast bureaucracy, running a rapidly expanding empire. They simply didn't have the luxury of funding metaphysical debates yet. Their interest was almost entirely restricted to practical sciences.
Okay, the source gives a really great example of this. Prince Khalid Bayezid.
Ah, yes.
Apparently, he was sidelined from the caliphate and sought consolation in esoteric studies.
Yes. Khalid, who died in 704, is a really fascinating transitional figure here. He is credited with providing for the very first translations of scientific works into Arabic.
But not philosophy.
No, these were strictly medical, astrological, and alchemical texts.
So they wanted Greek knowledge to cure diseases.
To predict the seasons and try to turn base metals into gold.
Right, they wanted utility, not philosophy.
Exactly.
But then the political landscape shifts dramatically, right?
It does.
The Abbasid dynasty takes power in the middle of the 8th century, they move the capital to Baghdad, and suddenly everything changes. This is where the translation movement just explodes.
And crucially, it explodes because it becomes heavily state-sponsored.
The government is paying for it now.
Exactly. Interest in science and philosophy permeated the culture to such an extent that it was no longer just the idiosyncratic hobby of a sidelined prince.
It was everywhere.
The state, the caliphs, the wealthy viziers, they all took an active, incredibly well-funded part in promoting it.
The way Fakhry describes the evolution of this movement is so fascinating because it follows a very natural human trajectory.
How do you mean?
Well, you start by adopting a new technology for purely practical reasons, like using Greek texts for medicine, right?
Right.
But then as the elite class gets comfortable with it, it becomes a status symbol. It becomes like entertainment.
Oh, yes. The source notes a specific phase where the translators began working on collections of moral aphorisms, which were often dubiously ascribed to famous figures like Socrates and Pythagoras.
Yeah, Fakhry mentions these were cherished by the wealthy elite for social refinement. It was a kind of intellectual adab.
Yes, adab.
What exactly does that term mean in this specific context?
Well, adab in this era roughly translates to refinement, culture, or bel-être.
Okay.
It was basically the mark of an educated, cosmopolitan gentleman in Baghdad
Yeah.
to be able to quote a witty moral aphorism from Socrates at a dinner party.
Like showing off your expensive watch, but with brain power.
Exactly. It showed you were worldly and sophisticated. So the Greek texts briefly became fashionable cocktail party fodder.
But eventually, the serious thinkers in the society look at this new operating system and realize it can do so much more than cure a stomachache or provide a witty quote for a party.
Right.
They realize they can use Aristotelian logic to completely rewrite their entire understanding of reality.
And that transition to abstract speculative philosophy, that was the final and most consequential stage.
Because they finally had the vocabulary.
Right. The translators themselves, having honed their linguistic skills on medical and ethical texts, began to tackle works of far greater speculative difficulty.
The heavy stuff.
And because they had built trust with their wealthy patrons over the years, they eventually induced those patrons to fund these incredibly dense, complex philosophical translations.
Okay, we really have to talk about who is actually doing this grueling work. Because initially, it wasn't the Arab Muslims themselves translating Aristotle, was it?
No, it wasn't. The primary architects of the early translation movement were Syriac-speaking Christians.
Christians?
Yes, and specifically, they belonged to unorthodox sects, the Nestorian and Monophysite communions.
Okay, wait. Why were these specific Christian groups the ones holding the keys to Greek philosophy in the Islamic Empire?
It's a great question. It actually comes down to their own theological history.
How so?
Well, the Nestorians and Monophysites had essentially been declared heretics by the mainstream Byzantine Church
Oh, wow. Over what?
over highly complex debates regarding the exact nature of Christ. You know, whether he had one nature or two.
Right.
And to survive and to prosecute their own theological battles, these Syriac Christians had to become absolute masters of Aristotelian logic.
Ah. So they already had the skills.
Exactly. They were already studying, copying, and translating Greek philosophical texts as a prelude to understanding their own theology, long before the Muslims even arrived.
They already had the mental infrastructure in place.
Perfectly positioned.
The source names specific giants in this field, like Hunayn, who died in 873, and Yahya bi Adi, who died in 974. They were the bridge, basically.
The essential bridge, yes.
But this leads to a twist in the narrative that is almost unbelievable to me when I read it.
The language barrier.
Yes. Fakhry states that the very first genuine Arab philosopher, Al-Kindi, and even later undisputed titans of Islamic philosophy like Averroes, they lacked absolutely any knowledge of Syriac or Greek.
It is honestly one of the most striking historical facts of this entire period.
It's crazy.
The greatest commentator on Aristotle in the medieval world, Averroes, could not read a single word Aristotle actually wrote in his native tongue.
How is that even possible? How do you build a philosophical empire on texts you can't actually read yourself?
Well, Fakhry attributes this massive blind spot to a contempt of the Arabs for all foreign tongues.
Contempt.
Yeah. It seems like their immense pride in the divine perfection of the Arabic language created a sort of cultural mental block against learning the languages of the people they conquered.
So it's just profound cultural chauvinism.
Essentially, yes. But it had a fascinating and perhaps unintended impact on how Islamic philosophy evolved.
How so?
Because these Arab philosophers couldn't read Greek, they were entirely reliant on the Arabic translations provided by the Syriac Christians.
Right. And as anyone who has used like an online translation app knows, you lose nuance when you translate.
You lose exactness, certainly.
Yeah.
The early Greek commentators who read Aristotle in the original, they were inextricably bogged down in the minute structural details of Greek grammar.
Obsessing over the words.
Right. But the Arab philosophers, working through a layer of translation, were somewhat liberated from that linguistic slavishness.
Oh. They couldn't obsess over the grammar, so they had to just obsess over the ideas themselves.
Precisely. This language barrier forced a completely unique, localized evolution of Greek thought.
That's amazing.
The concepts of Aristotle and Plato were extracted from their native Greek context and completely retailored to address the specific, urgent theological needs of the Islamic Empire.
That is just brilliant. But, I mean, injecting this highly contagious Greek spirit of relentless intellectual curiosity into a culture that was fundamentally built on religious revelation, that was never going to be a peaceful process, was it?
No. It was catastrophic to the intellectual unity of the empire.
I can imagine.
The text famously describes the introduction of Greek ideas as creating a permanent geological fault running through the entirety of Islamic history.
The society basically just cracked in half.
It really did.
Fakhry lays out the two sides of this divide perfectly for us. On one side of the fault line, you have the progressives, right?
Yes.
These were the thinkers who looked at this new Greek logic and earnestly sought to subject all the data of divine revelation to the rigorous scrutiny of philosophical thought.
Right, because they believe that truth is one.
Meaning,
true religion and true philosophy cannot possibly contradict each other.
right.
If there appears to be a contradiction, reason must be used to interpret the revelation.
Okay. And then on the other side of the chasm, you have the deeply conservative element.
We're reactionaries.
Right. We are back to the spiritual descendants of Malik and his don't ask questions approach. And they viewed this entire philosophical enterprise with absolute horror.
Complete horror.
Yeah.
They dissociated themselves entirely from philosophy, arguing that it was inherently impious.
Because it puts humans first.
Because it elevated human reason above divine revelation. And furthermore, it was suspiciously foreign. It was the science of the pagans.
And this geological fault line caused massive intellectual earthquakes for centuries, didn't it?
Oh, constantly.
The source notes that throughout Muslim history, almost all major reform movements were characterized by a deliberate, aggressive attempt to drag the culture back across that fault line.
They wanted to go backwards.
Right. They wanted to return to the simple, unquestioning assumptions of the good forebears of the early Muslim community.
Yes, Fakhry specifically names key reformers who led these reactionary movements. You have al-Ash'ari in the 10th century,
Okay.
Ibn Taymiyyah in the 14th century, and even figures as recent as Muhammad Abduh in the 19th century.
Wow, so it never really ended.
No, their goal was always to purge the faith of foreign philosophical corruption.
They were constantly trying to shove the Greek philosophical genie back into the bottle.
But they couldn't.
Right, because here is the brilliant, inescapable historical trap that Fakhry points out.
The trap of logic.
Yes. Even the most orthodox defenders of the faith, the group known as the Ash'arites, they found themselves caught right in it.
It's very ironic.
It's incredibly ironic. They were fiercely committed to defending traditional orthodoxy against heretics and freethinkers and the rationalist Mu'tazila we discussed earlier.
But they quickly realized a devastating truth.
What's that?
You cannot defeat a logical argument by simply shouting heresy.
Right. We talked about that.
If a rationalist is using Aristotelian logic to systematically dismantle your traditional belief, the only way to publicly defeat them and protect the faith is to find a flaw in their logic.
But to find a flaw in their logic, you have to learn logic.
Exactly.
You have to adopt their framework. You have to accept the rules of the Greek dialectic just to participate in the defense of your own religion.
The source articulates this brilliantly. I think the exact quote is, "It was as though the ghost of Greek dialectic could no longer be exorcised without recourse to the formula of exorcism which it had itself enunciated in the first place."
That is the ultimate trap of logical discourse.
It really is.
The very moment the conservative Ash'arites sat down at the debate table to prove that Greek philosophy was corrupting the faith, they had to use the tools of Greek philosophy to make their point.
By engaging in the debate, they validated the very operating system they were trying to destroy.
It's an inescapable paradox.
Completely inescapable. Once the vocabulary of Aristotle, You know, concepts like substance, accident, essence, and causality.
Wait, those Greek terms.
Once they entered the theological bloodstream of the empire, they could never be fully extracted. It permanently altered how Muslims thought about God.
But there were figures who tried to straddle this fault line, right? Fakhry points to Al-Kindi.
Yes, Al-Kindi,
Yeah.
the first genuine Arab philosopher.
They died around 866, and he seems to act as a kind of intellectual border guard here.
Al-Kindi is a fascinating figure because he embodied the tension perfectly. He was deeply invested in philosophy, but he retained a very strong orthodox theological bent.
So he tried to have it both ways.
He consciously stood on the borderline, attempting to harmonize the two worlds. He used philosophy to understand religion, but he actively worked to keep fundamental religious belief from being totally submerged and dissolved in abstract secular philosophical thought.
He was trying to hold the line.
Exactly.
But human curiosity is just a relentless force. The philosophers who came after Al-Kindi looked at that borderline and eventually just stepped right over it.
They could resist.
They pushed this new Greek operating system to its absolute dizzying limits.
And that leads to the final, most radical phase of this entire intellectual journey.
What happens?
The Islamic philosophical tradition ultimately could not resist the core temptation of the Greek ideal.
Okay, what exactly is that core Greek ideal? Break that down for us.
It is the ultimate exaltation of man.
Meaning?
It is a profound, almost hubristic faith in the boundless intellectual prowess of the human mind. The Greeks believed that human reason, if rigorously trained and applied, possessed the inherent ability to unlock the deepest mysteries of the universe entirely on its own.
Without any help.
Right, dispensing altogether with the need for divine revelation or supernatural light.
Oh, wow. If you follow that logic to its conclusion in an Islamic context, you cross a massive theological boundary.
The biggest boundary.
You move from saying reason helps us understand God's revelation to saying reason doesn't need God's revelation.
Exactly. And this shift birthed what Fakhry calls the illuminationist trend in later Islamic philosophy.
Illuminationist.
Right. Thinkers began to believe that pure reason could scale the ultimate heights of knowledge completely unaided. It could pierce the veil of mystery shrouding reality.
Let's break down the mechanics of this because it sounds almost like a sci-fi concept to me.
It is pretty radical.
For these later titans of philosophy, guys like Ibn Bajjah, who died in 1138, and Ibn Tufayl, who died in 1185, what was the actual finish line for them? What were they trying to achieve with all this logic?
Well, it wasn't just about being a good person and getting into heaven by divine grace anymore.
Right, traditional salvation wasn't the goal.
No, traditional salvation was no longer the ultimate prize. The absolute summit of human existence for these specific philosophers was a state of being they called contact or conjunction.
The Arabic term is itizal, right?
Yes, a tizal. And what they were trying to achieve conjunction with was the universal mind.
Or what they called the active intellect.
Because,
Conjunction with the active intellect. That is wild. It sounds like they believed they could literally upload their human consciousness into the cosmic mainframe of the universe just through pure, rigorous thinking.
That is actually a very apt analogy for the Neoplatonic concepts they're working with.
Really?
Yes. They believed that by perfectly ordering the mind, shedding material attachments, and mastering abstract logic, the individual human intellect could temporarily merge with the divine universal intellect that governs the cosmos.
But wait, seeking a direct transformative experience of the divine? That sounds incredibly mystical.
It does.
It sounds exactly like Sufism, the mystical tradition in Islam.
And this is where the history becomes incredibly complex and beautiful, I think, because philosophy and mysticism, which seem like polar opposites, begin to violently intersect.
How so?
Well, Fakhry notes that mysticism, or Sufism, historically fluctuated between being distinct from or sometimes directly contrary to rational philosophy.
Right, because traditional Sufism is usually rooted in an overwhelming awareness of God's majesty and a crushing sense of man's total nothingness without divine grace.
Which is the exact opposite of the Greek exaltation of man's powerful intellect.
Totally opposite. It seems like a massive contradiction.
It seems like one, yes. Yet, for some of the greatest Sufi masters, like the famous Ibn Arabi who died in 1240, their mystical visions culminated in grandiose cosmological and metaphysical schemes that were deeply philosophical in their structure.
So they used the vocabulary of philosophy to explain their mystical visions.
Exactly.
And it worked in the other direction too, didn't it?
It did. For philosophers like Ibn Bajjah and Ibn Tufayl, their intense, grueling philosophical preoccupations led logically and inevitably to the conception of mystical experience.
They called it illumination.
Right. And they viewed it not as a rejection of logic, but as the absolute crowning achievement of the reasoning process.
I just want to pause here for a second and marvel at the incredible distance this civilization traveled.
It's a huge journey.
We started this deep dive looking at a culture that was terrified to even question a linguistic metaphor about God sitting on a physical throne.
Asking questions is a heresy.
Exactly. We had Malik fiercely declaring that, and just a few centuries later, utilizing the exact same Arabic language, we have philosophers boldly claiming that the human mind can independently merge with the universal intellect of the cosmos through sheer logical force.
The intellectual whiplash is staggering.
It is one of the most breathtaking intellectual evolutions in human history.
It fundamentally redefines the nature of knowledge. For these late thinkers, the mystical experience wasn't a departure from reason. It was the final destination that reason had been driving toward all along.
It represents a breathtaking, albeit controversial, synthesis of the Greek faith in the human intellect and the Islamic pursuit of ultimate reality.
But, the source is very careful to note that not everyone bought into this grand, elegant synthesis.
History is rarely that clean, right?
Never. There were some incredibly sharp, discordant notes in this intellectual symphony.
The course of this development was never a perfectly straight line.
No, Fakhry highlights a fascinating group of nonconformist thinkers who simply didn't fit into the orthodox conservative camp, nor did they neatly fit into the new illuminationist philosophical camp.
Who were these solitary souls?
Men like al-Nizam, who died in 845, the brilliant free thinker al-Razi, who died in 925, and the famous deeply pessimistic blind poet and philosopher al-Mari, who died in 1057.
Why do they matter if they didn't really fit the mold?
They matter precisely because they didn't fit. They were dissident voices, radical skeptics, and iconoclasts.
Oh, I see.
Ultimately, mainstream Islamic society could not tolerate or accept their deeply nonconformist views. They were pushed to the margins.
Right.
But as Fakhry argues, you absolutely cannot overlook them without distorting the total historical picture. They serve as vital proof of just how incredibly diverse, explosive, and unrestricted the intellectual atmosphere of this era truly was before the boundaries of orthodoxy finally hardened.
It really was a wild frontier of thought. We have covered an immense, incredibly dense landscape today for you, our listeners.
We really have.
We started by exploring how the sudden, explosive introduction of the Quranic worldview forced a primarily oral tribal culture to completely reevaluate their reality and seek out new systems of knowledge.
We watched them grapple with the terrifying, weighty responsibility of interpreting a divine text.
We saw how the basic need for a functional legal code led to the birth of the traditional sciences, and eventually triggered those first fierce structural battles between liberal, analogical interpretation and strict, unyielding conservative literalism.
And we tracked how the intense pressure of defending their faith against sophisticated external philosophies, like the dualism of the Manichaeans, forced Muslim scholars to adopt the very logical tools of their intellectual rivals.
We saw how this necessity fueled the massive state-sponsored translation movement that resurrected Greek logic.
We examined the permanent geological fault line that Greek dialectic drove through Islamic thought.
We saw the inescapable trap where even the most orthodox, reactionary defenders of the faith were forced to become philosophers just to argue effectively against philosophy.
And finally, we followed that train of reason as it was pushed to its absolute limits.
Right, culminating in a worldview that sought a mystical, intellectual conjunction with the universal mind, boldly claiming it could be achieved unaided by divine grace.
It is a historical narrative that really forces you to reflect deeply on how human beings construct knowledge.
It shows how seeking to solve one very practical, immediate problem, like how to win a debate in a Baghdad marketplace, can inadvertently unlock an entire universe of complex, abstract questions that completely rewire your civilization.
The pursuit of knowledge is a fire that is rarely contained once it is truly sparked. And that reality actually leads me to a final, somewhat provocative thought for you to mull over, building directly on the trajectory we've traced today.
Oh, I love these. Let's hear it.
Well, if the ultimate crowning triumph of this philosophical movement was the deeply held belief that human reason could achieve ultimate conjunction with the universal mind, entirely unaided by divine grace, did the philosophers inadvertently engineer their own destruction within that society?
Oh, wow. That is a heavy question.
Think about the mechanics of a culturally grounded, faith-based society. If the intellectual elite pushes their logic to a point where they essentially claim they no longer require the very divine revelation that sparked their entire civilization's journey in the first place, they become a threat to the foundational glue of that society.
That makes total sense.
How could a traditional culture do anything but eventually reject them? It is a structural tension between boundless reason and foundational faith that perhaps explains why that historical geological fault line is still so incredibly visible and so heavily debated in the modern world today.
When logic claims it doesn't need the foundation it was built on, the house eventually has to divide. That is a phenomenal, lingering question to leave off on. We started this hour talking about how the history of ideas is never a clean blueprint, but rather a chaotic landscape of muddy waters. I think we have clearly seen exactly why those historical waters got so turbulent and how incredibly vital it is to wade into them. Thank you to you, our listener, for joining us on this exhaustive deep dive. Keep questioning the foundations of your own sources, keep seeking out those new operating systems of thought, and we will catch you next time.
I want you to imagine history, just for a second. How do you actually picture it?
Most people probably just see a timeline.
Right, exactly. Usually we're taught to see it as a straight line. You draw a line from the past, drag it right through the present, and point it toward the future.
Yeah, or, maybe you picture it like a biological life cycle. Like a civilization is born, it grows up, it gets old, and eventually, well, it dies.
Exactly. But what if we've been looking at it all wrong? I mean, what if history isn't a line and it isn't a life cycle at all?
That's the big question.
So imagine it instead as this ever-shifting, mingling wave of cultures, a vast ocean where waters are constantly crashing, separating, and merging together.
And throwing out that straight line, it completely changes how we understand the very ground we walk on today. Because history doesn't just march forward. It surges, it retreats, it splinters, and it recombines.
Yeah, but we cling to the biological metaphor, don't we?
Oh, absolutely. Because it's comforting. It's familiar to us. Birth, life, death. But that framework completely falls apart when you apply it to the actual empirical reality of human societies.
And that reality is exactly our mission for this deep dive. Today we are unpacking the introduction to a really fascinating text. It's called A History of Muslim Philosophy, Volume 1.
Written by Jan Muhammad Sharif.
Right. But to be clear right at the top, this isn't just an exploration of Muslim philosophy. That is the lens we're using, absolutely. But the actual target here is much, much bigger.
So much bigger. The text is really trying to break down the very laws of how human civilizations rise, how they fall, and how they regenerate.
Yeah, the author is attempting something quite radical here. He's going after the distorted mirrors that historians typically use.
Right, because most historians, they bring their prepackaged philosophies of history to the table, and they just force the facts to fit their theories.
Which is backwards.
Totally backwards. Sharif proposes the exact opposite. To truly understand the dynamics of history, he says you have to look at how a major, sprawling cultural group actually evolved over centuries.
So by surveying the actual course of Muslim society, a single cultural group subjected to the universal laws of growth and decay, we can spotlight the massive misconceptions that 20th century philosophers hold.
Exactly. Misconceptions about the very nature of progress.
So by the end of this deep dive, you are going to look at the rise and fall of modern nations, the nature of progress, and even, honestly, your own personal pursuit of ideals in a completely new light.
It really shifts your whole perspective.
It does. We are going to dismantle a lot of what you were probably taught in history class. And we're starting with this biological fallacy, the idea that a culture is a living organism.
Right. The text takes direct aim at a specific group of 20th century philosophers of social history. Thinkers like Nikolai Danilevsky, Oswald Spengler, and Arnold Toynbee. Very big names. And their core argument is that social history is like a wave that has a single rise and a single fall, never to rise again.
Wow. Never to rise again.
Yeah, they view a society or a culture as an organism with a strict, unrepeated life cycle. Childhood, maturity, old age, and death. Spring, summer, winter, and autumn.
I mean, I get it. It makes intuitive sense when you're watching, like, a documentary about the fall of Rome.
Oh, sure.
You see the founding, you see the glorious Pax Romana, the slow decay, and then the final collapse. It looks exactly like a lifespan.
It does. And the analogy actually dates all the way back to Plato, who conceptualized the state as an individual writ large. But analogies are only true up to a certain point.
Right.
Viewing a society on the exact analogy of an individual biological organism is definitively flawed. The author leans heavily on the work of a sociologist named Pitirim Sorokin to point out two major structural deficits in this thinking.
Okay, let's unpack those. What's the first one?
First is the concept of a gestalt.
A Gestalt.
Yeah. In psychology and biology, a gestalt is an organized whole that is perceived as more than the sum of its parts. Like an individual organism is a perfect gestalt.
Right, so like my heart, my lungs, and my brain are entirely integrated into one unified system.
Exactly. But no society on Earth is so completely unified into a single organic whole that it can be treated as a single organism.
Well, yeah, because humans have agency. I mean, a liver cell can't decide to suddenly rebel and go start a new liver outside of your body.
That would be terrifying.
Right. But a group of citizens absolutely can separate from a state and start a new one.
Precisely. The second structural deficit breaks down on the concepts of death and reproduction. An individual organism is born, it grows, it dies, and its species is perpetuated by biological reproduction.
Meaning it passes on genetic material to a new, distinct organism.
Right. But a culture cannot repeat itself in species by reproduction.
That makes sense. A culture doesn't have a child that is a miniature, genetically linked new culture. Like, you don't get a baby Rome.
You don't. And furthermore, when an individual organism dies, revival is impossible. You can't bring a dead organism back to life.
Unless you're in a sci-fi movie.
Exactly. But the revival of a culture is entirely possible. A supposedly dead culture can be revived by the activization of dormant vitality or by responding to fresh challenges.
Or by the infusion of new elements.
Correct. Exactly.
Okay, but I want to push back on this just a little bit, because we do talk about the birth and death of empires all the time.
We do, yeah.
So if a culture isn't a person that lives and dies, what is it? Is it more like a perennial plant? Like the visible part dies off in the winter, but the root system stays alive underground, and then it blooms again in the spring.
The perennial plant is a much closer analogy, but the text offers an even more fluid one. It talks about the mingled waters of different waves.
Mingled waters. Okay.
Yeah, the author draws a really sharp distinction between a state and a culture. States are born and they die, sure, but cultures are never born as organisms, nor do they die as organisms.
So the political structure can vanish, but the culture doesn't.
Right. Take ancient Greece, for example. Ancient Greece as a state died. The political entity completely collapsed. But after its death, a massive amount of Greek culture, its philosophy, its mathematics, its aesthetics, spread far and wide.
Yeah, it's everywhere.
It is still living as a vital element in the cultures of Europe today.
That is a crucial distinction. The political apparatus of the state is not the culture itself.
The text also provides the example of Jewish states. The political Jewish states ceased to exist at various points in history, facing, total political annihilation.
But the culture survived.
Exactly. Much of Jewish culture was taken over and integrated into Christianity and Islam. So the author's core thesis here is striking. He says, no culture dies in toto, though all die in parts.
Wow. So the parts of a culture that survive are effectively immortalized in succeeding cultures.
That's the idea.
Okay, so if a culture isn't a single organism that lives, dies, and disappears forever, we really need to understand how it is actually structured.
Right, like what its actual anatomy is.
Yeah, if it isn't a body with organs, what is the anatomy of a culture?
The author conceptualizes a culture as a supersystem.
A supersystem.
Yeah, and this supersystem is made up of a multitude of vast and small cultural systems.
Okay, so we're talking about the massive structural pillars of human society.
Yeah.
Right? Things like religion, language, law, philosophy, science, fine arts.
Ethics, economics, technology, politics, customs, all of those.
And each of those large systems consists of smaller nested systems.
Right, like science includes physics, chemistry, biology, mathematics includes geometry, algebra, arithmetic.
Yeah, makes sense.
But crucially, besides these connected systems, a culture also contains partly connected or wholly isolated heaps of cultural matter. The text calls these isolated elements congeries.
Congeries. Okay, so just random, disconnected heaps of cultural artifacts or ideas that don't neatly fit into the overarching system.
Exactly.
That sounds incredibly chaotic.
Well, that chaos is the point. A total culture is never just one perfectly harmonious, integrated system. It is a multitude of systems that are partly in harmony and partly out of harmony with one another.
Okay, can you give an example of that?
Sure. To illustrate this, the text points to the history of Muslim culture. Consider the Umayyad Caliphate of Damascus.
Oh, historically, that's often viewed as a massively powerful, well-knit empire. I mean, it stretched from Spain all the way to India.
It was a total political juggernaut. But even within that seemingly unified structure, groups like the Kharijites and the Shiites fell apart from the total structure.
Because they didn't align with the main system.
Right. They possessed entirely different theological and political congeries that just didn't integrate with the ruling system.
Interesting.
And later in the political sphere, Muslim Spain became not only independent of, but actively hostile to the Abbasid Caliphate of Baghdad.
And this was happening at the very time Muslim culture and thought were reaching their golden prime, right?
Yes. The cultural supersystem was thriving and expanding, even as the political supersystem was violently fracturing.
That is wild. Okay, so if a culture is this giant, chaotic super system of mingled waters, how does it respond to a truly existential threat?
That's the real test.
Because the text brings up a massive historical test case.
Yeah.
The Mongol onslaughts in the 13th century.
Yeah. If you want a historical event that looks exactly like the absolute violent death of a civilization, it's the Mongol invasion of the Islamic world.
Just total devastation.
The text notes that this was arguably the strongest challenge the world has ever seen. The Mongol armies, led by Hulagu Khan, sacked Baghdad in 1258.
And Baghdad was the center of everything at that time.
It was. It seemed to affect the total devastation of Muslim lands. The House of Wisdom was destroyed. The legend is that the Tigris River ran black with the ink of scholars' books and red with the blood of the philosophers.
God, that visual is just horrifying. It really looked like the absolute end of the wave.
It did, but according to the super system theory, it wasn't the end.
So what was it?
The author argues it was merely a depression.
A depression? That sounds like a wild understatement given the carnage.
It really does sound like an understatement, but in the grand timeline of cultural evolution spanning thousands of years, that's exactly what it was. Within hardly half a century, the culture began its first major revival.
Okay, we have to unpack the mechanics of that. How does a super system bounce back from the total annihilation of its political center and its intellectual hubs in 50 years?
The text attributes this revival to two specific mechanisms. First, the culture's inherent vitality.
Meaning the roots were just too deep.
Basically, the cultural supersystem, the religion, the shared laws, the daily customs, was so deeply rooted across such a vast geography that it couldn't be completely sapped.
Yeah.
Not even by an unprecedented disaster at its center.
Wow.
As the author poetically puts it, soon rain-bearing clouds gathered and these lands were again green and teeming with life.
That's beautiful. But there was a second factor too, right?
Yes. The second factor is the real mechanical driver. The revival was fueled by the infusion of new elements. Specifically, the fresh blood of Turkish slaves and mercenaries, and eventually the Mongol conquerors themselves.
Wait. The conquerors who burned the libraries fueled the revival of the culture.
They did, because the Mongols eventually converted and came into the fold of Islam.
That is mind-blowing.
When they integrated into the cultural supersystem, they brought with them the immense vigor and vitality of their nomadic ancestors. They completely destroyed the existing political state, but they were ultimately absorbed by the cultural supersystem.
And they ended up creating new, massive Islamic empires in the aftermath.
Exactly.
You know, I want you to think about this when you read the news today. You look at global events, and it's so easy to think a specific conflict or collapse is the absolute end of a society.
Oh, we do that all the time.
We do. But what looks like the final chapter might just be a severe depression before a completely unexpected regeneration.
A dark winter before a spring.
Right. And the most mind-bending part is that the regeneration might be fueled by the very forces that disrupted the society in the first place.
It really forces you to take a longer view of history. This historical reality proves that cultures don't just have one cycle of birth, maturity, and death.
They can have many.
Yeah, they can have virtually indefinitely long spans of life with many social, intellectual, and political ups and downs. The text notes that Egyptian civilization rose and fell at least 4 times.
4 times. Wow.
And the Greco-Roman Byzantine culture rose and fell several times. China and India had 2 big creative impulses and, well, according to the author writing in the mid-20th century, a third has now begun.
So we've established that cultures are resilient supersystems capable of multiple regenerations. But if as cultures go through these multiple cycles of springtime, do they all express that springtime in the exact same way?
That's a great question, and it brings up another huge flaw in the biological metaphor.
Because if we look at thinkers like Peter Paul Ligeti, Frank Chambers, or Charles Lalo, they try to map the biological life cycle directly onto art.
They do. They argue that a culture in its infancy will always produce a specific primitive art form. And as it matures, it moves to more complex forms in a totally predictable sequence.
So it's like a universal checklist for cultural evolution.
Yeah.
They're basically saying, congratulations on reaching societal maturity. Here is your mandated era of oil painting.
Exactly. Their hypothesis claims it is always the same art and the same style of art which rises at specific stages in the life history of every single culture.
It's so rigid.
Extremely rigid. There is one specific art form that always appears at a culture's dawn, another at its maturity, and yet another at its decline.
But the author completely rejects this conclusion, right?
Completely. He uses the empirical survey of Muslim thought and culture to dismantle it. The sequence of artistic evolution is entirely dependent on the specific conjuries and systems within a given culture.
It's not a one-size-fits-all timeline.
No, not at all. For example, if you look at the ancient Greeks, the art form that blossomed and matured first was music.
Okay.
But if you look at the French, the German, and the English cultures, it was architecture that reached maturity first.
And the specific path of Muslim culture is completely different from both of those. In Muslim culture, the text notes that literature blossomed first.
Which is fascinating.
It really is. And it makes complete sense when you consider the deep pre-Islamic roots of oral poetry in the Arabian Peninsula, which then synthesized with the revelation of the Quran.
Exactly. The linguistic and literary systems were already highly developed. Interestingly, painting, far from being an early development as it was in some other cultures, was actually the very last of all its artistic development.
Really, the very last.
Yeah. Music and architecture rose simultaneously, and sculpture is given no place at all.
None at all. But, the delay in painting and the total absence of sculpture isn't a sign of cultural immaturity. It's a direct result of the cultural supersystem's theological rules.
Right, the internal logic of the culture.
Yeah, because the Islamic stance on aniconism, the avoidance of creating images of sentient beings to prevent idolatry, actively suppressed those specific art forms.
Exactly. So expecting Islamic culture to produce sculpture on the same timeline as the Greeks completely ignores that context.
It just shows the flaw of the biological metaphor applied to art.
And it's not just the sequence of the arts that varies, it's the style within those arts, too.
Oh, really?
Yeah. The text points out that in some cultures, the earliest style of art is heavily symbolic. In others, it's naturalistic, or formal, or impressionistic, or expressionistic.
So judging all cultures by the artistic timeline of one, which is usually a Western one, is just ridiculous. It's like expecting a novelist, a painter, and a coder to all develop their skills in the exact same sequence.
That's a great way to put it.
You wouldn't tell a brilliant software engineer, well, you haven't mastered watercolors yet, so your software isn't truly mature. It's an absurd metric to apply to human aesthetic creativity.
It really is. Which brings us to an even more fascinating disconnect in how cultures evolve.
Let's hear it.
We've talked about the disconnect between political states and cultural survival and the disjointed evolution of art. But the most pivotal concept in the text, and arguably the most relevant to our modern world, is the profound disconnect between a society's intellectual brilliance and its moral decay.
Okay, this is where it gets really real. Let's look at what actually causes the collapse of civilizations. It's very easy to blame outside forces, right?
Oh, it's the easiest excuse in the book.
Right. We just talked about the Mongols destroying Baghdad, or the Christian monarchs of the north attacking the Umayyad Caliphate of Spain, or even Western imperial powers causing a later decline.
But the author brings up philosophers like Albert Schweitzer, who rightly contend that a flourishing civilization requires a minimum of ethical values vigorously functioning.
A minimum of ethical values.
Yeah. When those ethical values decay, the civilization decays. The author insists that external attacks were really only contributory factors to the collapse of these empires.
So what was the main factor?
The basic conditions of the rise and fall of nations invariably arise from within. The root cause, in each historical case the text examines, was moral degeneration.
Moral degeneration? But what are the actual mechanics of that? How does a functioning society rot from the inside?
The text points to a very specific trajectory. The decay is brought about by centuries of luxury and overindulgence in worldly pleasures.
So getting too comfortable.
Exactly. As a society becomes fabulously wealthy and secure, that superabundance of wealth results in a whole progeny of social ills. You see a rise in extreme disunity, deep social injustice, jealousies, rivalries, political intrigues, indolence, and sloth.
Wow. So a society gets too rich, the ruling class gets too comfortable, the wealth gap widens into massive social injustice, and the whole moral fabric just disintegrates.
That is the pattern. And in the case of a later decline in the Muslim world, from about 1700 to 1850, the text notes this moral degeneration was combined with the worst type of conformism.
Conformism.
Yeah, the Arabic term often used is taqlid or blind imitation.
Blind imitation. That doesn't sound good for innovation.
It wasn't. It was a societal shift that actively deadened all original thought. People started relying entirely on the rulings of past generations.
I see.
And without this internal moral and intellectual downfall, the author argues, there would have been no cultural decline regardless of how many external threats appeared on the borders.
But wait, there is a massive contradiction in the historical record here.
Let's hear it.
You would naturally assume that as a society is morally decaying, as the political structures are violently fracturing, everything else, including intellectual output, would be collapsing too.
You would assume that, yeah. But the author points out that a culture can be declining politically and morally, yet simultaneously rising to its absolute peak intellectually.
That is such a paradox.
It is. The decline in the politico-social sphere can sometimes actually become a stimulus for intellectual advance, provided there is a deep-rooted tradition of the patronage of learning.
So let's look at the timeline. The political and moral decline of the Abbasid Caliphate of Baghdad began in the middle of the 9th century. The collapse of the Umayyad Caliphate in Spain began in the early 11th century.
Right.
Muslims were losing their political solidarity everywhere, and massive, unified caliphates were breaking apart into petty states, sundry warring dynasties. It was a time of total political fragmentation.
Total chaos. Yet that exact same period, stretching right up to the Mongol devastation in the mid-13th century, was precisely when the Muslim intellect reached its full flowering.
While everything was falling apart politically.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The intellectual achievements didn't just maintain the status quo, they kept rising from peak to peak, while the political ground was literally crumbling beneath them.
The text lists a staggering array of minds that flourished during this moral and political valley. I mean, you have illustrious philosophers like Al-Farabi, who was synthesizing Aristotelian political philosophy with Islamic theology.
Brilliant thinker.
And you have Ibn Sina, or Avicenna, whose canon of medicine became the standard medical text in Europe and the Islamic world for centuries. You have Al-Ghazali fundamentally reshaping theology, and Ibn Rushd, or Averroes, defending rational philosophy in Spain.
It's an incredible list, and you also have renowned scientists and mathematicians doing groundbreaking empirical work during this time.
Like who?
Well, Ibn al-Haytham was practically inventing modern optics and the scientific method. Omar Khayyam was making massive leaps in algebra and astronomy.
Oh, wow.
And in the literary and mystical spheres, giants like Rumi and Attar were producing work that still resonates globally today. I mean, Rumi's most important work, the Masnavi, was written in the decades immediately following the traumatic sack of Baghdad.
That's just a profound paradox. When moral degeneration sets in, a culture's intellectual and scientific achievements may stay and even thrive, but they cannot avert the eventual collapse of the society.
Right. The intellect alone cannot save a morally bankrupt state.
And the author turns this directly onto the modern world with a chilling warning, doesn't he?
He does. The text explicitly states that there is a severe lesson here for those who are using their high intellectual attainments for the conquest of the moon, Venus, and Mars.
And keep in mind, the author is writing this in the mid-20th century, right at the dawn of the space race.
Exactly. His point is that you can be achieving unparalleled scientific, technological, and intellectual heights, but you may yet be culturally on the decline if a superabundance of wealth is leading your society to luxury, license, and moral degradation.
I really want you, the listener, to think about that. Look around at our world today. We have rapid, mind-boggling technological advances. We're making leaps in artificial intelligence. We are launching private rockets. We have medical miracles that were unimaginable a century ago.
It's true. The tech is incredible.
But ask yourself, are we in an intellectual peak that is masking a moral decline? Are we making the exact same mistake the text outlines, confusing technological brilliance and extreme wealth with actual cultural health?
It forces us to entirely reevaluate how we measure progress.
It really does.
And if we are going to reevaluate progress, we have to address how global history is actually recorded and taught. Because if a culture's history is this complex, with multiple regenerations, disjointed artistic growth, and the paradox of intellectual peaks during moral valleys, why is history usually presented as a simple, straight line of continuous Western progress?
That is the big question. And the text vehemently critiques the linear, Eurocentric view of history championed by 18th and 19th century thinkers.
We're talking about the titans of Western philosophy here. Hegel, Marx, Kant, Spencer, Herder, Fichte.
The heavy hitters.
Yeah, and the author aligns himself with Arnold Toynbee, who described this conception of history as an egocentric illusion.
Egocentric illusion. I love that term.
It's perfect. These 18th and 19th century Western thinkers basically looked at history as if it were identical with Western history. They viewed human progress as one straight line of events moving inexorably across the Western world.
They took their own localized timeline, chopped it into three neat little boxes, ancient, medieval, and modern, what the text calls the three-knotted yardstick.
Right.
And then they tried to force the entire rest of the globe into that framework.
And the result is a profound distortion of the historical record. They took massive, complex civilizations, the Egyptian, Indian, Chinese, Babylonian, each of which had passed through several of their own distinct stages of development, and they lumped them all together into the briefest possible prelude to the Greco-Roman period.
So they just squished them down.
Exactly. Sometimes millennia of complex history were reduced to a single introductory page. If an event in another civilization didn't easily link to the chain of events in the West, it simply didn't count.
The text highlights a specific glaring example of this egocentric illusion in practice. The author brings up a collaborative book published in the 20th century called The History of Philosophy, Eastern and Western.
Yeah, sponsored by the government of India and edited by eminent scholars.
And the author's indictment of this book is sharp. He notes that while the Eastern editors tried to fix some flaws in how ancient history was treated, they completely failed when it came to what the West calls the medieval period.
A total failure.
This so-called medieval period actually covered the phenomenal rise and development of Muslim thought, spanning centuries, stretching from Spain to Indonesia. It was an era that carried human achievement in the intellectual field to one of its highest historical peaks.
And yet, out of 48 chapters covering this period, only 4 were assigned to Muslim thought.
4 out of 48.
By minimizing it so drastically, the history completely ignored the deeply documented role of Muslim philosophy in advancing empirical sciences, preserving and transmitting Greek thought back to the West, heavily shaping Western scholasticism.
Including the work of Thomas Aquinas, right?
Yes, including Aquinas, and ultimately providing the intellectual stimulus that helped spark the Italian Renaissance and influence Western thinkers from Descartes to Kant.
So they erased the very bridge that connected ancient philosophy to the modern world.
They really did. And the omission becomes even more egregious when the book moves to the modern period. The philosophical developments of the East outside of India are completely omitted.
Just gone.
The text notes that a reader of this comprehensive history is left with the impression that from the time of Descartes to the present day, the East intellectually ceased to exist.
Now, the text does offer a mundane, almost comical reason for this specific omission in this particular book. The editors apparently did intend to have more chapters on Muslim philosophy in the modern era, but the writer to whom the chapters were assigned have also been appointed as a state minister.
That is honestly so funny.
Right. His heavy official duties left him no time to write the chapters. It's the ultimate, the dog ate my homework excuse on a civilizational scale.
It is amusing, but the author stresses the broader structural point. This isn't just about one busy minister failing to meet a deadline. This massive gap exists in almost all histories written by Western scholars, and even those written by Eastern scholars trained in Western paradigms.
Because they're using that three-knotted yardstick.
Exactly. Mankind consists of a multitude of countries, each with its own drama, its own possibilities, its own goals, and its own life course. If you try to represent human history lineally, it wouldn't be one line. As the author says, it would be several lines, or rather, bands of variegated and constantly changing colors, reflecting and merging into one another.
So to truly understand history without this egocentric linear bias, we have to rethink the very engine that drives human progress.
We have to ask what actually moves history forward.
Right, because if it isn't a biological clock ticking down, what is the mechanism?
This brings us to the philosophical core of the text. There is a controversy that has raged in the philosophy of history for a long time regarding the laws that govern historical sequences.
Okay, let's break this down. Who are the players?
On one side, you have the empiricists, thinkers like Herbert Spencer, Karl Marx, and going back to Giambattista Vico in the 18th century.
What was their view?
They argue that historical events follow the unswerving laws of nature. The law of mechanical causality is universal. It's all push and pull. In Aristotelian terms, they believe history is entirely driven by efficient causes, the physical, material forces pushing from behind.
So we're basically just billiard balls being knocked around by physics and economics.
Exactly.
And on the other side of the debate,
You have the idealists, like Max Weber. They argue that historical events are not like units in physics. They are unique, unrepeatable events occurring in a specific time and space, driven by human values and culture, not mechanical facts.
so therefore you cannot form physical laws about them at all.
Right. The author of our text says both of these groups go to extremes.
How so?
Well, the empiricists completely ignore the freedom of human will, our resolves, choices, and goals. We aren't just billiard balls being smacked around by economics, but the idealists forget that human beings exist in a physical world and must place their choices into a chain of mechanical causality to actually achieve anything.
So the author argues for a synthesized middle ground.
Yes. History consists of human achievement based on resolves and choices, utilizing mechanical causation as a tool. But to really understand how radical the author's new hypothesis is, we have to dive deep into the heavyweights of historical philosophy.
You mean Hegel and Marx?
G.W.F. Hegel and Karl Marx. Their dialectical models of how history moves have completely dominated the modern world.
Let's start with Hegel, the dialectical idealist. For Hegel, the whole world is the unfolding development of the idea with a capital I, a grand rational entity.
Right.
And this idea advances through a very specific mechanism. It poses itself as a thesis. It then develops from itself its own inherent contradiction, its opposite, an antithesis.
And these two ideas, the thesis and the antithesis, inherently clash. But instead of remaining constantly at war until one is destroyed, they are united into a higher truth, a synthesis.
And then that synthesis becomes the new thesis for another triad, right?
Exactly. And this mechanical process drives the world to higher and higher reaches of progress. For Hegel, the historical process is essentially a process of antagonisms and reconciliations.
Okay, now Marx takes that exact same dialectical structure, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, but he swaps out what is actually fighting.
Because Marx was a materialist.
Right. For Marx, the world stuff isn't some grand rational idea. It is strictly material. It is energy, economics, and class structures. So a real material condition, like capitalism, creates its opposite, the proletariat.
They clash in a violent struggle and synthesize into a new reality.
So both Hegel and Marx are fundamentally arguing that history is an epic, constant wrestling match.
It is a system built entirely on warfare, hostility, and struggle against an opposing force. Hegel's system logically encourages wars between nations, as he views the state as the ultimate realization of the idea on Earth. Marx's system logically encourages wars between classes. In both models, the dialectic is driven by hatred and opposition.
But the author points out a massive flaw here, doesn't he?
He does. He says both Marx and Hegel completely ignore the most universal law of human nature. They recognize the efficient causes, the material realities pushing us from behind, but they entirely ignore the final causes.
The final causes, meaning the goals, values, and ideals that pull us forward.
Exactly. This is where the text presents its revolutionary alternative, the dialectic of love.
The dialectic of love. That sounds so fundamentally different from a wrestling match.
It is. The author argues that a real human or a real society, which is the thesis, creates from within itself an ideal, the antithesis. Now, purely logically speaking, a real thing and an ideal thing are opposites. What is real is, by definition, not ideal, and what is ideal is not yet real.
Right, because my ideal self is not who I currently am. The ideal society is not the flawed society we currently live in.
But, and this is the genius of the author's hypothesis, because one is real and one is ideal, they are not enemies in their function. Hegelian ideas and Marxist reals are mutually warring. They are separated by hostility and hatred.
But in the author's hypothesis, the real and the ideal are bound by love and affection.
Exactly.
Wait, I have to challenge this.
Okay.
Isn't conflict absolutely necessary for historical growth? I mean, if we are just lovingly pursuing ideals, how does this dialectic account for the massive bloody revolutions, the wars, and the intense struggles that actually move society forward? Is the author saying history is just a peaceful march toward goodness?
Not at all. The struggle is still very much present, but the orientation of the struggle is fundamentally different. We don't struggle against our ideals, we struggle for them.
Oh, I see.
To achieve an ideal, a society must utilize mechanical causality. They must fight against the limitations, the oppressors, or the material scarcities that stand between the real and the ideal.
So the conflict is a byproduct of pursuing the ideal.
Right. If you look at Marxist history, it's like a game of tug of war. You have two hostile forces pulling violently against each other until one falls into the mud. The author's dialectic is more like a massive magnet pulling iron filings forward.
That's a great visual.
The force driving the movement is attraction to the magnet, to the ideal. The friction the iron filings experience as they scrape across the ground toward the magnet represents the real, often violent struggle of history. But the engine of the movement is love for the ideal, not hatred of the opposing force.
The dialectic of human society isn't inherently a struggle of warring classes or nations. It is a struggle against limitations to realize goals and ideals that are willed and loved.
Yes.
Think about your own life. Are you driven purely by fighting against the things you hate? Or are you pulled forward by the vision of what you love and what you want to achieve? The author's arguing that this pull of ideals is the true engine of human civilizations. It leads individuals, masses, nations, and cultures from lower to higher reaches of achievement.
And this hypothesis perfectly aligns with the nonlinear, non-organismic view of history we established at the beginning. It envisages society not as a biological clock winding down, but as a vast number of interacting individuals and intermingling cultures moving towards infinite ideals, now rising, now falling, but on the whole developing.
Having established this beautiful framework of history, driven by the pursuit of ideals, moving in mingling waves, we need to map this onto the actual history of Muslim philosophy that the text is introducing.
Right, bringing it back to the empirical evidence.
The author lays out 5 distinct stages, and it perfectly proves this multi-wave theory.
The 5 stages demonstrate the rises, the falls, the depressions, and the regenerations in empirical detail. Let's walk through them.
Let's do it.
Stage 1 is the early centuries. This covers the massive span from the 7th century to the fall of Baghdad in the 13th century.
This is the first great rise. It features the initial expansion of Islam, the translation movement that absorbed Greek, Persian, and Indian thought, and massive theological, mystical, and scientific breakthroughs.
It was a wildly productive era.
This is the era of the Mutazilites debating rationalism, the Ash'arites formulating orthodox theology, and the early development of Sufism. And, as we discussed, it proves the paradox that intellect can thrive even as the political caliphates fracture.
Exactly. Then, following the destruction of Baghdad, we enter stage 2. The shock-absorbing period.
The Depression.
Yeah, this is the half-century following the Mongol devastation. It represents the Depression where the culture survived not through political might, but purely on its inherent vitality and the strength of its core religious and legal systems, eventually absorbing the Mongol conquerors.
Which leads directly to stage 3, the later centuries. From the 14th to the early 18th century, the culture experiences a massive second flowering.
This is a profound regeneration. The cultural supersystem spreads across 3 massive new empires: the Ottoman Empire spanning Europe and the Middle East, the Safavid Empire in Persia, and the Mughal Empire in India.
A huge geographical spread.
Huge. You see incredible syntheses of culture, monumental architecture like the Taj Mahal and the Blue Mosque, and deep philosophical developments, particularly in Persia, with thinkers like Mulla Sadra.
But the wave crashes again in stage 4, the Dark Age. A century and a half from the mid-18th to the mid-19th century of deplorable decline.
This is that period of all-around moral degeneration we analyzed earlier. The extreme wealth of the empires led to internal rot. Crucially, it was marked by taqlid, that worst type of conformism that deadened original thought.
And that made them vulnerable.
Very vulnerable. The philosophical and scientific engines of the supersystem ground to a halt, making the societies incredibly susceptible to the rising tide of Western colonialism.
Which brings us to the final stage, stage 5, the modern Renaissance, from the mid-19th century onwards.
This represents a new rise, sparked initially by the shock of colonial domination. It is marked by a political struggle for emancipation and a deliberate, painful break from the deadening conformism of the Dark Age.
And interestingly, the philosophers of this current era are not just cloistered academics, right?
No, they are very engaged. Thinkers like Jamal al-Din al-Afghani or Muhammad Iqbal were political leaders, social reformers, and men of action. They were actively utilizing mechanical causality political movements, writing, activism, to pursue the ideal of a revitalized, independent culture.
It tracks so perfectly with the author's thesis. History is not a straight line of constant progress. It isn't a single lifespan that ends inevitably in a graveyard. The text gives this incredible imagery for this new hypothesis of history. It is like clouds moving over mountain peaks,
Such a vivid image.
constantly rising from the foothills, mingling, separating, flying over the peaks, sinking into the valleys, and yet ascending from hill to hill in search of the highest peak.
It's a highly dynamic, open-ended view of human potential. It avoids the arrogant assumption that certain living cultures are condemned to death because their season has passed, and it leaves the door of future achievement wide open to all societies.
We've covered incredible ground today. We dismantled the biological fallacy that cultures live and die on a set schedule. We exposed the terrifying paradox that a society can be at its absolute intellectual and technological peak while simultaneously rotting from moral decay and extreme wealth.
We covered a lot.
We rejected the three-knotted Western yardstick that tries to force the entire globe onto a single Eurocentric timeline. And we discovered a completely new dialectic, an engine of history, driven not by the hatred of warring opposites, but by the gravitational pull of our highest ideals.
It is a framework that demands a lot more of us as participants in history. We aren't just along for a mechanical ride dictated by economics, and we aren't doomed by a biological clock. Through the ideals we choose to love and pursue, we are actively carving our own destinies.
The author notes that no culture dies in toto. In respect of those parts of culture which live, each culture is immortal. The best parts of ancient Greece, the deepest wisdom and scientific foundations of the Islamic Golden Age, they didn't die. They're still alive, mingling in the waters of our current reality.
They are all still here with us.
I want to leave you with this final thought. If civilizations are just mingled waters, and we are currently swimming in this messy, chaotic, technologically brilliant but morally complex global culture, what specific golden thread from our current world do you think will survive? When the wave of our current era inevitably dips into a valley, what ideal are we creating right now that will be immortalized into civilization thousands of years from now? Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Keep striving for your ideals.
So I want you to imagine, just for a second, lying completely motionless in a pitch-black subterranean cave.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, just totally dark. And you've been down there for days on end. It's just absolute terrifying sensory deprivation.
That sounds intense.
Right. Like you can't see your hand in front of your face. You can't hear a single sound from the outside world. I mean, you are barely even feeling the cold stone beneath you anymore.
You're just totally isolated.
Exactly. And eventually your brain, which is just completely starved of all input, it starts to fracture. Or, maybe for the very first time in your life, you finally see reality as it actually is.
Oh, I see where you're going with this.
Yeah. So in this darkness, a sun goddess appears.
Yeah.
And she leads you to this massive mansion of light. She hands you the fundamental secrets of the universe, and she commands you to take them back up to the surface.
It sounds like a myth, right? Like some ancient fantasy story.
It totally does. But here's the crazy part. You emerge from that cave, blinking in the sunlight, and you use those exact secrets to invent the structural foundation of Western logic.
Yeah, that's the real twist there.
It really is. So welcome back, learner. Today we are taking a deep dive into a journey that is going to, honestly, completely dismantle your understanding of where reason and logic and, well, human thought actually come from.
It's going to flip everything upside down, really.
For sure. We're immersing ourselves in the historical revelations unearthed by the philosopher Seyyed Hossein Nasr. We're looking specifically at excerpts from his really profound introduction to a book called Philosophy and Prophecy.
Which is such an incredible piece of writing. It really is.
It is. And our mission for this deep dive, we're going to explore this deeply buried, just incredibly surprising historical marriage between rigorous logic, which we call philosophy, and mystical revelation or prophecy.
Right. The two things we always keep totally separate.
Exactly. We're going to uncover how the ancient Greek founders of Western thought, the very people modern science credits with inventing strict rationality, how they were actually mystics. They were healers and seers.
It's just a total paradigm shift.
It is. We are going to deconstruct this deeply ingrained modern assumption that you and I have, that reason and spiritual vision are somehow like polar opposites.
Yeah, it really is a seismic shift in perspective because we are we are incredibly conditioned to draw this hard, impenetrable line between the rational, calculating mind on one side and the spiritual or mystical experience on the other.
We treat them like they're enemies almost.
Exactly. But the historical record we are looking at today, it just meticulously dismantles that boundary. It shows us that if you go back to the origins, historically, those two domains weren't just friendly with each other.
Right.
They were inextricably linked. They were literally the exact same pursuit at the very root of human intellectual endeavor.
Which is so hard to wrap our heads around today. Like, learner, if you're listening to this on a commute right now,
Yeah?
surrounded by concrete, staring at taillights, constantly checking your phone.
A modern world, yeah.
Yeah, all of this concept of multiple levels of reality probably feels incredibly alien. We are so conditioned by our modern environment to just see the concrete.
Just the physical stuff in front of us.
Right. We feel completely overwhelmed by this cold, data-heavy modern world. And if you've ever wondered why all this endless, instantly accessible information rarely ever translates into actual wisdom,
Oh, that's such a good point.
then this deep dive is going to give you a massive aha moment about what we fundamentally lost along the way. So, okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
We have this massive foundational bias in the modern world. When we hear the word philosophy, we picture a very specific thing.
Oh,
right?
totally. We picture, rigorous thinking, dense academic papers, complex logic puzzles.
Strict, dry rationality. A guy in a tweed jacket writing on a chalkboard.
Yeah, exactly. The academic stereotype.
And conversely, when we hear the word prophecy, our minds immediately go to someone gazing into a crystal ball.
Fortune telling, predicting the end of the world.
Yeah, or maybe like someone having a chaotic hallucination on a street corner with a cardboard sign.
Right. And that fortune teller stereotype, that is the exact trap we need to escape before we can even begin to understand this history.
It's a huge roadblock.
It really is. Nasr provides a crucial redefinition of prophecy right out of the gate in this text, and we really have to strip away all of our modern baggage to grasp it.
So how does he define it then?
Well, prophecy, in the traditional, universal, and historical sense, is absolutely not about predicting the future. It has nothing to do with guessing who will win a war or what the stock market will do.
Right, no crystal balls.
None at all. Instead, prophecy is strictly defined as the function of bringing a message from higher or deeper orders of reality back to a specific human community.
Bringing a message from higher or deeper orders of reality. Okay, that shifts the entire paradigm.
It completely changes the conversation.
Because it's not about time, right?
Yeah.
It's not about looking forward into the future. It's about depth. It's about looking down into the fabric of reality, or maybe up into a higher dimension of it.
Precisely. It is a spatial or, well, an ontological shift, not a chronological one. And what's absolutely crucial to understand here is that this concept is not just limited to the Abrahamic faiths.
Right, because when we hear prophet, we immediately think of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam.
Exactly. But the historical framework we're exploring today points out that this specific reality, this act of bringing a message from deeper levels of existence, it's present across the entirety of human history.
It's everywhere.
It is. It's across wildly diverse religious climates.
Yeah, the historical scope here is just massive. I mean, we're talking about the Hindu rishis in ancient India who literally heard the cosmic sounds of the Vedas.
Yes, perfect example.
And we are talking about shamans across various indigenous traditions, who enter trance states to navigate the spirit world and bring back healing.
Or the Greek Itramantis.
Which translates to healer prophets.
That's right. And we see it in the immortals of Taoism, in the profound illumination of the Buddha, in Zen Buddhist masters experiencing Sapori.
That sudden reality-shattering illumination.
Yeah, and in the prophets of Iranian religions like Zoroaster, this isn't just some localized cultural quirk. It's a truly universal human phenomenon.
It's like the defining intellectual technology of the ancient world.
It really is. And to really grasp why this redefinition matters so much, we have to look at the underlying requirement for prophecy to even exist in the first place.
Okay, what do you mean by underlying requirement?
Well, for a message to be brought from a, quote, higher or deeper order of reality, you first have to fundamentally accept that reality actually has levels. You have to believe in a hierarchy of existence or a hierarchy of consciousness. You have to believe that the world you can touch and see is not the totality of what exists.
And that right there is exactly where the friction happens with how we think today. That's the exact point of divergence, I think.
Oh, 100%.
Because the traditional view is this multi-level reality.
Yeah.
But we live in an era defined by what is often called scientism.
Yes. Scientism.
And scientism isn't just
the practice of science, right? Like,
Yeah.
it's not just the scientific method. It's the philosophical belief that reality is just a single, objective, corporeal world.
Right. It's just the physical stuff we can measure with instruments.
Protons, neutrons, electrical impulses, just the stuff. And importantly, scientism dictates that our ordinary, everyday, waking consciousness is the only legitimate form of consciousness.
Which is a huge assumption when you think about it.
It really is, because under scientism, everything else, dreams, visions, transcendent states, it's all just dismissed as merely a biochemical misfiring in the brain.
Right. If you operate purely under that framework of scientism, then any claim to prophecy or any claim to accessing higher levels of consciousness is just automatically meaningless.
It's a glitch in the hardware.
Exactly. It's categorized as a delusion. Because if there is no other world, if there are no deeper levels of reality, then bringing a message from them is, well, it's logically impossible.
So anyone claiming to do so isn't a visionary.
Yeah.
They're just having a subjective, internally generated hallucination.
Right. They are pathological, not philosophical.
You know, I was trying to figure out a way to visualize this clash of worldviews for the deep dive today, and I keep coming back to the analogy of a video game.
Oh, I like that. How so?
So modern scientism is essentially like playing a video game on a flat 2D screen. You just accept that what you see on the screen, the pixels moving around, the characters, the immediate environment, that's the entire universe.
Right, that's all there is.
That's all there is. And science is the rigorous study of how those pixels interact on that screen.
Okay, yeah.
But traditional philosophy, the kind fueled by this redefined concept of processy, it views reality more like putting on a fully immersive VR headset, where you intimately understand that there are deeper levels of code, physics engines, and hidden invisible architecture generating the visuals you see.
That is a highly effective way to visualize the divide, honestly. The traditional worldview accepts the underlying code.
Let me push that metaphor just a little further, though.
Go for it.
If modern science is the act of studying the pixels on the 2D screen, measuring them, predicting their movements, which it does brilliantly, by the way.
Oh yeah, it's incredibly effective at that.
Then prophecy is the act of somehow breaking through the screen to read the underlying binary code.
Yes. The prophet is the one who sees the zeros and ones.
Right. And if you are a 2D screen player and a prophet comes along talking about the underlying code of reality, you're going to think they're completely losing their mind.
You'll say, show me the code on this flat screen, measure it for me.
And of course they can't, because the code isn't made of pixels.
Exactly. And that brings us to the role of philosophy in this whole ecosystem.
Okay, how does philosophy fit in?
If prophecy is reading the binary code, philosophy is acting as the software engineer.
Oh, I see.
It translates that binary code into an architecture, a language, and a system that the people operating on the surface level can actually understand and interact with.
So it bridges the gap.
Yes.
Yeah.
What's fascinating here is how prophecy provides the absolute raw material for philosophy.
How so? Walk us through the actual mechanics of that. Like, how does a prophet's vision become a philosopher's logic?
Well, historically, prophecy hands down the fundamental frameworks that philosophy then works with. The visionary experience provides three main pillars, essentially.
Okay, what are they?
First, it provides cosmogony, which is the knowledge of how the cosmos was created, where it came from, and how it is structured across those multiple levels we talked about.
Okay, so the origins.
Right. Second, it provides pneumatology, which is the nature of the human soul. This is traditional psychology, not the study of brain chemistry, but the study of the spirit's journey and its constitution.
Wow, okay. And the third?
Third, it provides eschatology, the knowledge of the end of things, the ultimate destination of the human soul and the universe itself.
So prophecy delivers these profound, massive realities.
Exactly. Philosophy, then, in its original ancient sense, is the act of thinking deeply and rigorously about these revealed realities.
So philosophy isn't just pulling ideas out of thin air.
No, not at all. Philosophy doesn't invent the ultimate truths from scratch. It takes the raw data brought back from the higher levels of reality, the gold mine from deep underground, so to speak, and it applies intellectual rigor to it.
It seeks to understand it, unpack it, systematize it.
Yeah, and apply it to ethics, politics, and daily life. Philosophy has to philosophize about something. It needs an object of contemplation.
Right, it needs raw material.
And in traditional worlds, that object has always explicitly included the realities revealed through prophecy.
Okay, this brings us to a massive, just earth-shattering turning point in the historical record Nasr presents.
Yes, the big reveal.
Right. If prophecy is about accessing these higher levels of reality, to bring back knowledge, if it requires diving into the deep code of the universe.
Yeah.
How exactly did the so-called perfectly rational founders of Western philosophy get their ideas?
Right, because that's not the story we're told.
Exactly. The textbook narrative, the one you and I were taught in school, is that ancient Greeks just sat around in sunlit courtyards, wearing togas, doing geometry, and inventing secular logic out of sheer, unadulterated brain power.
Completely disconnected from anything mystical.
Right, just pure reason.
And that is exactly where this historical excavation completely shatters the conventional Western narrative. The big reveal here, the reality that has been systematically scrubbed from our intellectual history, is that the fathers of Western logic were not just secular rationalists doing arithmetic.
They weren't just sitting in armchairs.
No, they were deeply mystical figures. They were seers.
Okay, so if Pythagoras laid the groundwork for mathematics, who actually built the structural framework of the logic we use today? But wait, let's actually start with Pythagoras, because I feel like he is the perfect gateway into this.
He really is.
Everyone knows the Pythagorean theorem from high school geometry. A squared plus b squared equals c squared. When you hear the name Pythagoras, you think of a dry math guy.
Right, just drawing triangles in the sand.
But looking at the historical record, Pythagoras actually coined the term philosophy, the love of wisdom. And he was certainly not an ordinary secular rationalist like a Descartes or a Kant.
Far from it. Pythagoras was a profoundly esoteric figure. He was renowned in his own time for having extraordinary prophetic powers.
Wait, prophetic powers? Like, wait.
Well, he didn't just open a school of mathematics. He founded an entirely new, highly secretive religious community. His followers believed he could remember his past lives, that he could actually hear the music of the spheres.
The music of the spheres.
Mm-hmm.
Like literal music.
Yeah, the literal audible harmony of the cosmos. And his teachings on mathematics were entirely tied to mysticism. Numbers weren't just quantities to him.
They were just tools for measuring.
Right, they were divine entities. They were the living archetypes of reality.
So it wasn't just doing math, it was communing with the divine through the language of mathematics.
Exactly.
The record even notes that centuries later, Islamic scholars referred to Pythagoras as a monotheist, a muwahhid, and some outright categorized him as a prophet. Like he was operating on a completely different level of spiritual revelation.
He really was. But the most striking example, the one that really drives this home, is the figure who comes slightly later, Parmenides.
Right, this is where it gets incredibly intense. Parmenides is universally heralded as the literal father of Western logic and ontology.
Yes, the bedrock of it all.
He is the guy who first articulated the laws of non-contradiction and identity. He is usually presented to philosophy undergrads as this strict, cold rationalist who just happened to write his brilliant logical arguments in a poem of notoriously dense, difficult quality.
Right, they treat the poem like an annoying stylistic quirk.
Exactly. But the historical evidence, particularly the brilliant modern studies by the scholar Peter Kingsley that Nasr relies heavily on, completely proves that Parmenides was actually a visionary.
Oh, absolutely.
He was deeply immersed in the world of prophecy, working within ancient Greek religious and magical traditions.
Yes. For centuries, Western academics looked at Parmenides' foundational text, this poem, and they basically apologized for it.
Apologized for it, like they were embarrassed.
Pretty much. They said, well, he had great logical ideas, but he unfortunately decided to write them down as a mythological story.
Right, like he just didn't have the format down yet.
Exactly. But Kingsley's work, and Nasr's synthesis of it, shows that the poem isn't just a quirky stylistic choice. The poem is a literal descriptive account of a visionary journey.
Okay, tell me about this journey. What happens in the poem?
In it, Parmenides explicitly describes being led away from the world of human illusion. He is escorted by the daughters of the sun.
The daughters of the sun.
Oh, yeah, and they take him on a chariot to the gates of the other world, to the mansion of light, situated at the farthest degree of existence.
And what happens there?
It is there, from the mouth of an unnamed goddess, that he is handed the laws of logic.
Okay, wait, I have to stop you here. The father of Western logic, the bedrock of our scientific method and rational thought, claims he got his foundational ideas by being escorted by sun goddesses in a chariot to a mansion of light.
That is exactly what he claims, yes.
That sounds like a profound psychedelic trip, not a logic seminar. Come on, a sun goddess. How did he supposedly get there? Like, what is the actual mechanism he was using to achieve this state?
This is where we have to dive into the physical reality of ancient spiritual practices. The mechanism is a specific, highly rigorous practice known as incubation.
Incubation, like keeping an egg warm.
Sort of, but for the soul. This was a well-known central spiritual technology in certain branches of Greek religion, particularly those associated with healing and the god Apollo.
Okay, how did it work?
Incubation involved a person going into a completely dark subterranean chamber or a cave and resting completely still.
Just lying there.
Yes, not just for an hour, but for days. They would engage in absolute sensory deprivation.
Okay, let's really think about the physiological effects of that. Sensory deprivation.
Yeah.
Extreme, prolonged sensory deprivation.
It does a lot to a person.
Yeah, modern science has actually studied this extensively with isolation tanks and the Ganzfeld effect. When you completely starve the human brain of sensory input, no light, no sound, no temperature fluctuation, the brain doesn't just turn off.
No, it goes into overdrive.
It panics, and then it starts generating its own reality to fill the void. Modern psychology might call this a hallucination. But ancient traditions framed this entirely differently, didn't they?
They did. To the ancient mind, the physical senses are a veil. They are a loud, chaotic static that distracts you from the underlying reality.
The static on the 2D screen.
Exactly. By removing all sensory input, you aren't creating a hallucination. You are turning down the volume of the physical world so that the subtle frequencies of the spiritual world can finally be heard.
So it's not a misfire.
No, the brain isn't misfiring. The soul is being unshackled from the body to travel to higher levels of reality where the mysteries of existence are revealed.
And the specific Greek word for this stillness, this practice, is fascinating. It's hesychia.
Yes, hesychia.
I want to read this quote directly from the historical context because it hits so hard when you realize we are talking about the origins of logic. So, quote, "For Parmenides, it's through stillness that we come to stillness. Through stillness, we come to understand stillness. Through the practice of stillness, we come to experience a reality that exists beyond this world of the senses."
It's beautiful, isn't it?
It is. His own teacher, who was apparently a poor and obscure man, he didn't teach him syllogisms. He taught him how to be completely, utterly still.
It is a profound concept, and it is vital to understand that this wasn't just taking a nap in a dark room.
Right, it's not just relaxing.
No, this was an active, grueling, rigorous spiritual discipline. You are systematically shutting down the input from the physical world, turning off the 2D screen, to go back to your analogy, so that the deeper binary code of reality becomes perceptible.
And furthermore, Nasr makes an incredibly striking historical connection here.
Oh, the connection to hesychasm.
Yeah.
Yes.
This exact term, hesychia, used by the ancient founder of Greek logic, doesn't just disappear into history.
No, it becomes the very foundation of hesychasm centuries later. Hesychasm embodies the central esoteric teachings and mystical prayer practices of the Eastern Orthodox Christian Church.
Wait, really? The exact same word?
The exact same word in practice. It's aimed at the attainment of sanctity, divine light, and gnosis spiritual knowledge. It's the exact same spiritual technology persisting across millennia.
Okay, I have to push back here, or at least express my sheer, absolute bewilderment on behalf of any modern person listening to this right now.
I don't blame you at all.
We are talking about the man who basically invented the mechanical engine of Western rationality.
Yes.
And he got his blueprints by lying motionless in a dark cave until his consciousness altered so radically that a goddess gave him the answers.
That is what the historical record indicates.
How on earth did modern history scrub this out of the textbooks? I took Philosophy 101. We talked about Parmenides. No one mentioned the sensory deprivation cave or the sun goddesses.
It's remarkably absent, isn't it?
It's crazy. How did we lose the fact that logic was born in a state of mystical incubation?
Well, it wasn't just lost, it was actively, deliberately discarded.
Deliberately. Why?
It speaks to a systematic sanitization that occurred over centuries in the West, particularly peaking during the Enlightenment. Think about the psychological need of the early modern scientists and rationalist philosophers.
Okay, what were they trying to do?
They were trying to establish a new worldview based purely on empirical observation and mathematical deduction. They desperately needed intellectual ancestors.
They needed a pedigree.
Exactly. They looked back to the Greeks and said, here are the first rational men. But when they read the actual text, they found all this, well, mysticism.
It was embarrassing to them.
Extremely embarrassing. So they essentially performed historical surgery.
Historical surgery, I like that.
They kept the logical deductions, the laws of non-contradiction, and they completely discarded the context of how those ideas were generated.
Just chopped it right off.
The mystical elements, the incubation, the goddesses, the journeys to the mansion of light, they were increasingly viewed as primitive superstitions. They assumed Parmenides just used them as colorful metaphors because he didn't have the modern vocabulary to express his pure logic.
Like we assumed he was just like us, writing in a slightly weirder format.
Exactly. We completely ignored the literal practices and profound altered states of consciousness that birthed those ideas.
It's exactly like we kept the math homework, but we burned the journal where he wrote down the bizarre mystical method he used to actually get the answers.
That's a perfect way to phrase it.
But let's look closer at what actually happened in that cave, or in that vision. Because Parmenides wasn't just lying in the dark for his own personal enlightenment, right?
No, it wasn't just about him.
He wasn't just trying to achieve a bliss state and stay there. The goddess didn't just give him a grand tour of the universe and send him home. She commanded him to do something very specific with this knowledge.
Yes, and this is where the concept of prophecy really locks into place. In the poem, the goddess explicitly tells Parmenides to take what she has taught him back to the human world, to the surface, and to be her messenger.
To be her messenger.
And here, the historical context provides an essential linguistic clarification. The literal root meaning of the Greek word prophets is messenger, or one who speaks on behalf of another.
Oh, wow.
It means someone whose job is to speak for a great power, a divine source. Again, it isn't about predicting the future, it's entirely about transmission.
And when she addresses him, when she first speaks to Parmenides, she uses a very specific word, doesn't she?
She does.
She calls him kouros, which translates to young man or youth.
Right. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, this one word, kouros, opens up a cross-cultural web that is absolutely mind-bending.
Mind-bending how?
Nasr unpacks a fascinating linguistic and spiritual parallel here that bridges incredibly distinct worlds. In the Islamic tradition, there is a profound esoteric concept of spiritual chivalry.
Spiritual chivalry.
Yes. In Arabic, it is known as futuwa, and in Persian, jawan mardi.
Okay, stop right there for a second. Spiritual chivalry. When you say chivalry, my mind immediately goes to King Arthur, knights in shining armor, jousting.
Medieval codes of conduct for warfare.
Exactly. Are we talking about a military code here, or is this concept of youth something completely different?
It is entirely different from the Hollywood knight in armor trope. Futuwa is an esoteric inner code of moral and spiritual purity.
Okay.
It is about embodying the virtues of the divine in the human realm. Radical generosity, unflinching courage, total selflessness, and a commitment to truth.
So where does the youth part come in?
The youth aspect isn't about biological age. It represents a state of spiritual readiness, a lack of calcification, a soul that is still malleable and pure enough to receive the imprint of divine truth.
So it's about being a spiritual warrior, fighting the ego, rather than a physical warrior fighting an army.
Exactly. And the linguistic connection is what's so stunning. That term for spiritual chivalry, futuwa, is directly derived from the Arabic word for youth, fata.
Just like kouros.
Yes. Just as the Persian jawan mardi comes from jawan, meaning young man. This tradition of spiritual chivalry is said to have existed before Islam, but it was given profound new life within Islam.
How so?
Its ultimate source and perfect embodiment is universally associated with Ali. Ali received this spiritual mantle directly from the Prophet of Islam, and it became deeply integrated into Sufism, the inner mystical dimension of Islam.
Wow.
Furthermore, Ali is recognized by traditional sources as the foundational figure of Islamic metaphysics and esotericism.
Okay, let me make sure I am grasping the magnitude of this parallel.
It's big.
You have the goddess of light in ancient Greece calling Parmenides, the founder of Greek logic, a young man, a kouros, as she hands him the keys to reality.
Right.
And thousands of miles away, and centuries later, the foundational center of Islamic metaphysics and spiritual chivalry is associated with the exact same linguistic and spiritual archetype of youth fata.
It's not a coincidence.
It heavily implies a shared spiritual lineage, or, at the very least, an identical spiritual archetype that fundamentally connects the esoteric roots of ancient Greece with Islamic Sufism.
Precisely. It suggests that these traditions, despite their geographical and chronological distances, are tapping into the same universal perennial realities.
They are accessing the same deeper order of reality, same code.
Yes. And the evidence doesn't stop with Parmenides. The historical record brings up another vital Greek figure, Epimenides of Crete.
Epimenides.
He was also historically given the title Kouros. He was an iatromantus, a healer prophet, and he engaged in the exact same practice of cave incubation.
Epimenides is fascinating, actually. The legends say he lay motionless in a cave for years, not just days.
Years, yes.
He journeyed to the other world, he met the goddess of justice, and crucially, he brought back laws to this world.
That is the key detail right there. He brought back laws.
Right. That shows this wasn't just about personal, inward-looking enlightenment. They weren't just navel-gazing in the dark.
Not at all.
The knowledge they accessed in these profoundly altered states had direct, rigorous, practical application for structuring human society. They brought back logic, they brought back legal codes, they brought back cosmologies.
They were healers, prophets, and civilization builders all rolled into one.
And Nasr points out that we have hard, physical, archaeological evidence for this, not just textual interpretation of old poems. Look at the Velia excavations in southern Italy.
Yes, Velia is absolutely critical. Velia was Parmenides' actual home, the city where he lived and taught.
And what did they find there?
When archaeologists excavated there, they found physical inscriptions that connect Parmenides directly to the god Apollo and to these specific iatromantus healer-prophet figures.
So he was part of a tradition.
He wasn't just an isolated thinker sitting in a study. He was allied to, and likely the leader of, a formal tradition of healer priests in the service of Apollo Ulios, Apollo the healer.
Wow.
They were experts in entering trance states, making journeys into other worlds, and bringing back healing and wisdom.
And there is a brilliant esoteric distinction mentioned in the research regarding Apollo. When we learn Greek mythology, we are taught that Apollo is the sun god.
Right, he drives the chariot of the sun across the sky.
We think of him as a god of literal, physical light, but the deeper esoteric tradition clarifies something profound, right?
It does. It says, quote, Apollo is not the god of light, but the light of God.
Apollo is not the god of light, but the light of God. That distinction changes everything.
It shifts Apollo from being a mere naturalistic deity, a personification of a burning ball of gas in the sky, to being a profound symbol for divine illumination.
It's about inner light.
Yes. He represents the light of higher consciousness, the light of intellect, the light of revelation. It aligns ancient Greek philosophy at its very genesis with the concept of prophecy conceived even in the terms of the Abrahamic faiths.
The act of bringing the light of God down into the human intellect.
Precisely.
So we have these early philosophers who are actually healer-prophet lawgivers, incubating in caves, engaging in extreme sensory deprivation, accessing the light of God, and reading the universe's binary code.
It's quite the resume.
It is. But here is the massive practical problem. How on earth did they transmit this profound, reality-shattering, nonverbal knowledge to everyday people?
Yes. The problem of transmission.
Right, because if you come back from the Mansion of Light, you can't just hand out a printed syllabus or a math worksheet. The experience is ineffable. How do you pass that on to a student without losing its power?
They had to use a cognitive technology capable of holding and transmitting that kind of charge, and that technology was poetry.
Poetry. But not poetry like we think of it today, not a Hallmark card, and not a modern poet expressing their subjective feelings about a rainy day.
No, absolutely not. In the modern world, poetry is largely seen as an aesthetic exercise, a form of self-expression.
Right.
For these ancient figures, poetry was a highly precise functional tool. They used incantations. Parmenides, Empedocles, Pythagoras, they all utilized hypnotic repetitions, specific rhythmic structures, and precise meters like dactylic hexameter.
So the rhythm actually mattered.
The rhythm and the breath required to recite these poems were deliberately designed to alter the consciousness of the listener and the reciter.
It's fascinating when you look at the modern neuroscience of this. We know now that rhythmic drumming or chanting, or the specific rhythmic structures of ancient poetry, actually shift the brain's wave states.
Oh, absolutely.
It moves the brain from the chaotic, everyday beta waves into alpha or theta states, which are associated with deep meditation, trance, and high receptivity.
Exactly. The language itself was the vehicle. The historical record also notes they introduced stories and legends from the East, from places like Anatolia, Tibet, and India, weaving them into the Greek context.
They were essentially writing a software patch for the human brain.
I love that analogy, yes. The poem of Parmenides wasn't just a description of his journey. It was an acoustic and linguistic map designed to induce the state of hesychia in his disciples.
Making the journey into other worlds possible for them as well.
Exactly.
So they were hiding the mechanism inside the art. The research focuses specifically on Empedocles here, and it's a great example.
He's a very interesting figure.
Yeah, Empedocles was a legendary figure, a sorcerer, a poet, a prophet, and a healer. He wrote extensively about physics and cosmology. He theorized about the elements, but he didn't write about physics just to provide dry, empirical facts about how rocks fall or how stars move.
No, he didn't care about physics for the sake of engineering.
Right. He wrote his physical theories to save souls.
Yes, to save souls. That completely and utterly reorients the purpose of learning about the natural world.
How so?
If you are learning cosmology to save your soul, then the universe isn't just a machine to be exploited. It is a sacred text to be deciphered.
So what does this all mean for our definition of philosophy? It means ancient philosophy was fundamentally initiatic and esoteric.
It was an initiation.
It was not intended for public debate in the town square. It wasn't about winning an argument on a debate stage or publishing a paper to get tenure.
No, it was a rigorous, highly guarded spiritual practice meant only for those capable of receiving the message and doing the arduous inner work.
The poem of Parmenides is literally an initiation ritual into another world.
It is a radical difference in the very definition of what knowledge is for. For the ancients, knowledge isn't something you simply possess, like a tool in a toolbox.
Right, it's not just data.
Knowledge is meant to act upon the knower. True philosophical knowledge transforms your very state of being.
And the most incredible part of Nasr's historical synthesis is that this exact same approach to philosophy, this union of rigorous logic and visionary initiation, is mirrored perfectly in Islamic philosophy.
Absolutely. The similarities are not just coincidental. They represent a continuous stream of this perennial wisdom.
Wow.
The Islamic philosophers deeply revered these pre-Socratic Greek figures, and we see several monumental Islamic philosophers who operated in exactly the same way, using cosmology, rigorous logic, and visionary experience to save souls.
Give me an example.
Take Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna. He is famous globally as a titan of medicine and Aristotelian logic, but he also wrote profound visionary recitals, mapping out the soul's journey through the cosmos.
So he was doing both. And Suhrawardi, who is heavily highlighted in the text.
Yes. Shihab al-Din Suhrawardi, the founder of the Illuminationist school of Islamic philosophy, Suhrawardi explicitly integrated profound mystical vision, the unveiling of the spiritual world, with incredibly rigorous logic.
So they weren't separated for him either.
Not at all. For Suhrawardi, philosophy without visionary experience is blind, and visionary experience without rigorous logic to articulate and test it is dangerous. They must be combined.
Yeah, that's a powerful way to frame it.
The Illuminationist school isn't just about thinking about light as a metaphor. It is about purifying the soul until it literally experiences the divine light of reality.
It's an entire lineage. Nasir Khusraw, Omar Khayyam, and later titans like Mullah Sadra in the 17th century.
Yes, all of them.
They all saw philosophy not as an abstract academic exercise, but as a holistic path to spiritual salvation and inner transformative knowledge.
It was a way of life.
Think about how we consume information today, you and I. We are obsessed with the hack.
Oh, definitely. The quick fix.
It's all about extracting quick data points, summarizing a 300-page book into a 5-minute read, getting the key takeaways so we can sound smart in a meeting or win an argument online. We're just endlessly hoarding pixels on our 2D screens.
That's a sad but accurate way to put it.
But traditional philosophy was entirely different. Plato literally defined philosophy as the practice of death.
The practice of death. It sounds morbid to modern ears, but it is deeply profound.
Right. He didn't mean physical suicide. He meant a spiritual practice combined with intense intellectual activity aimed at killing the ego, killing the false superficial self, and radically altering your consciousness so that the eternal part of you could awaken.
They were trying to transform themselves into different kinds of beings.
Not just pass a test.
It requires a total commitment of the self, not just the brain.
So this brings us to the inevitable, massive question. If ancient Greek philosophy and Islamic philosophy shared this exact same DNA, this profound, beautiful union where rigorous logic and mystical prophecy were basically two wings of the same bird, why do the East and West look so entirely different philosophically today?
That is the million-dollar question.
How did we end up with this massive, seemingly unbridgeable gulf between secular Western rationalism and Eastern spiritual traditions?
This brings us to the historical tragedy that we might call the Great Divergence. Nasr outlines a very clear historical split, tracing exactly when and why the West walked away from this union.
Okay, when did it happen?
It began around the end of the Middle Ages in the 14th and 15th centuries. In the West, philosophy began to actively, intentionally distance itself from theology and from what is often called the perennial philosophy.
The perennial philosophy, meaning those universal, enduring metaphysical truths about the higher levels of reality.
Yes.
It started systematically severing the ties. Why? Because of the rise of empirical science.
Exactly. As the scientific revolution began to gain steam, the physical world became incredibly manipulable. Through physics and mechanics, we could predict the movement of planets, we could build better machines.
We could control nature in ways we never had before.
Right. And this success was intoxicating. And so philosophy, which used to be the queen of the sciences, mapping the whole of reality, began to shrink its jurisdiction.
It got smaller.
By the 17th century, Western philosophy felt increasingly forced to philosophize almost exclusively about the picture of the world painted by the emerging modern sciences. It became, in the words of the text, a mere handmaid of modern science.
It stopped looking at the binary code and just became obsessed with analyzing the pixels.
Precisely. This trajectory peaked with figures like Immanuel Kant, who argued that we essentially can't know the things in themselves, the ultimate realities, and we should just stick to the phenomena, the world of the senses.
Just stick to what we can measure.
Right. This mindset entirely dominated 20th century Anglo-Saxon analytical philosophy. Philosophy in the West essentially reduced itself to logic and language games tied strictly to a material scientific worldview.
So it turned its back on prophecy completely.
It did. In doing so, it didn't just separate from religion, it actively turned against it, positioning itself as a rival for truth rather than a partner. It divorced heaven to marry the earth.
Wow. Divorced heaven to marry the earth. And what was happening in the Islamic world during that exact same period? Did they undergo a similar secularization?
The exact opposite, particularly in Persia after the devastating Mongol invasions of the 13th century, which destroyed so much physical infrastructure. Islamic philosophy turned deeply inward.
It didn't secularize.
No. Instead, it became the main arena for the continuation of philosophical life, and it actually drew closer to the inner realities made available through prophecy. Figures like Mullah Sadra actively wove together rigorous Aristotelian logic with the mystical unveilings of the Sufis. They maintained the synthesis. They deepened their esoteric roots while maintaining their logical rigor.
There's a famous Arabic dictum quoted in Nasr's research that perfectly captures this enduring synthesis. Philosophy issues from the niche of prophecy.
It is a beautiful phrase.
Such a beautiful image. It's like prophecy is the lamp containing the divine fire, and philosophy is the light radiating from it, illuminating the room of the human intellect. You can't have the light without the lamp.
It is the perfect metaphor for the traditional worldview, and Nasr points out a fascinating, almost tragic irony happening right now in modern academia.
What's the irony?
Today, you have secularized Muslim scholars, deeply influenced by Western universities, who are trying to artificially separate Islamic philosophy from its roots in prophecy.
Wait, really? Why?
They want to sanitize their own history to mimic the modern West's historical trajectory, trying to prove that Avicenna or Averroes were just pure rationalists, completely ignoring their mystical works.
They are trying to perform the exact same historical surgery on their thinkers that the West performed on Parmenides.
Exactly. But the immense irony is that simultaneously, top-tier Western philosophers are increasingly realizing that purely materialistic secular philosophy is a dead end.
It leads to nihilism.
Exactly. So now, in the West, they are actively forming societies and academic departments to resuscitate Christian and Jewish philosophy, trying desperately to find a way to bring philosophy and theology back together.
It's like the West, having realized the house is empty, is desperately trying to find the very thing that some in the East are currently trying to throw away to be more like the West.
It's a tragic comedy of intellectual history.
It really is. I want to emphasize why all of this dense history matters to you, the learner listening right now, because it does matter.
It matters deeply.
Whether you consider yourself secular, deeply religious, spiritual but not religious, or none of the above, understanding this historical divergence is the key that explains the modern crisis of meaning.
That void we all feel.
Yeah. When philosophy became just logic stripped of any connection to a higher reality, when it stopped trying to read the code and just analyze the pixels, It left a massive, aching void in the human psyche.
It left us stranded on the surface.
We have more data, more scientific capability, and more technological power than at any other moment in the history of our species. But as a culture, we feel hollow, we feel adrift. Data alone, empirical facts alone, cannot fill the fundamental human need for wisdom, for a connection to the deeper code of reality.
It raises arguably the most important question for our modern era.
Oh, it is.
How do we reconcile this? How do we balance our incredible vital capacity for compartmentalized empirical scientific knowledge with our deep, undeniable, and historically proven need for spiritual wisdom?
It's a tough balance.
Have we built a world that is incredibly, terrifyingly smart, but fundamentally, dangerously unwise?
That is the perfect summary of the tension we are all living in. We've gone on an incredible, mind-altering journey today.
We covered a lot of ground.
We really did. We started by completely redefining prophecy, escaping the cheap fortune teller stereotype to understand it as the profound act of bringing messages from deeper realities.
Right.
We uncovered the absolute historical bombshell that the origins of rigorous Greek logic lay in mystical, cave-incubating visionaries like Parmenides, who were guided by goddesses.
And we saw the connections.
Yeah, we saw how this ancient Greek wisdom shared an identical spiritual archetype, the youth, with Islamic esoteric philosophy, and how they both use the technology of poetry to save souls.
The software patch for the brain.
Exactly. And finally, we traced the tragic historical split, where the West traded the light of God for scientific materialism, reducing philosophy to a mere handmaid of science, while Islamic philosophy kept the glorious union of logic and revelation alive.
It completely reframes not just the history of human thought, but the potential of the human mind.
It really does. And I want to leave you, the listener, with one final lingering thought. It built entirely on this concept of hesychia, that profound, ancient stillness, and the practice of sensory deprivation incubation we talked about.
The dark cave.
Right. Parmenides literally birthed the foundation of Western logic by lying perfectly still in the dark, engaging in absolute sensory deprivation until deeper levels of reality reveal themselves to his mind.
It took total silence.
Think about our current era. Think about your life today. We are absolutely terrified of stillness. We flee from it. We fill every single silent moment of our day with a podcast, even this one, a scroll through social media, a screen, a notification, music in our headphones.
Constant input.
We are constantly, relentlessly bombarding our senses with the loudest, brightest pixels on the 2D screen.
We never let the brain rest.
If the foundational blueprint of human logic and wisdom required absolute silence and physical stillness to be downloaded into the human mind, by constantly stimulating our senses, by refusing to ever be bored or quiet, are we biologically firewalling ourselves from the very higher orders of reality that made us philosophers in the first place?
That's a chilling thought.
Next time you have a free moment, try turning everything off.
Yeah.
Just sit in the dark, be perfectly still, and just see what speaks to you. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.